Okay, Chair Tatayan, we are rolling and the floor is yours.
Marley, if you could start your recording as well, please.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the July 15, 16, 2021 Delta Stewardship Council meeting. I'm Susan Tatayan, Chair of the Council. Very glad to be able to be with you virtually today. Let's start with establishing a quorum roll call, starting with Judge Damrell.
Damrell here.
And Virginia. Virginia.
Virginia Madueño present.
Maria.
Maranian present.
Don.
Don Natoli here.
Christy.
Smith present.
And Daniel.
Zingali here.
Yes, Tatayan here. We have a quorum. Let's see here. On to a bit of housekeeping. If any member of the public is interested in providing public comment, please send an email blue card to the clerk at engage@deltacouncil.ca.gov as seen on the screen. Be sure to note your name and the agenda item that you wish to comment on. Also, please note if you wish to speak or would like the clerk to read your comment for you. When called upon, the clerk will unmute your line or read your comment if requested. So on to agenda item 3, public comment on any topic not on the council's agenda. Is there any public comment?
No, Madam Chair, there is not.
Okay. Then on to item 4, public hearing regarding the appeals of the certification of consistency for the Lookout Slew Tidal Habitat Restoration and Flood Improvement Project. So let me get my opening statement here. Good morning. I am Susan Tatayan, Chair of the Delta Stewardship Council, and this is the time and place for the public hearing to receive comments on the proposed determination that contains staff's recommended findings regarding the appeals of the certification of consistency for the Lookout Slew Tidal Habitat Restoration and Flood Improvement Project, which for convenience may be referred to throughout this hearing as the Lookout Slew Project. Following this second and final hearing on appeals of the Lookout Slew Project, the Council will consider the proposed determination and adopt findings pursuant to Water Code Section 85225.25. The Council published a notice of public hearing and adoption meeting on June 23, 2021. An agenda for the hearing can be found in the Bagley-Keene meeting notice, which was posted on the Council's website on July 2, 2021. Let the record reflect that it is 9:05 a.m. on Thursday, July 15, 2021. This hearing will be conducted entirely remotely via CalSpan and Zoom. There will not be a public in-person access location. Today, we will have a staff presentation followed by oral presentations from the parties to the appeal and the Delta Protection Commission. I will call each presenter in order. If a presenter is not ready or available at the time they are called, they will forego their presentation. The order of oral presentation is the Department of Water Resources or Department, the Delta Protection Commission or Commission, Liberty Island Access, Solano County Water Agency, Reclamation Districts 2060 and 2068, and the Central Delta Water Agency. We will take a lunch break around noon. The Department of Water Resources will be allowed 40 minutes for oral presentation. The Delta Protection Commission and each appellant will be allowed 10 minutes for oral presentation. After each oral presentation, council members will have an opportunity to ask questions of each presenting party. Before we begin, the council's legal advisor, Vera Bezdacek, will remind the council of our ex parte restriction and answer any questions about its scope.
Good
Vera?
morning. Yes, good morning. Thank you. The council's administrative procedures regarding appeals require that I remind the council of the ex parte communication restriction at this meeting. The ex parte communication restriction is a requirement of California's Administrative Procedure Act and the council's appeals procedures. It prohibits any communication, direct or indirect, regarding any issue in the proceeding to the council or council members from an employee or representative of an agency that is a party, or from an interested person outside the agency without notice and opportunity for all parties to participate in the communication. What that means here is council members and council staff cannot and should not communicate about or discuss the Lookout Slew or the council's appeal proceedings with any person outside of the council. The only exception is communications regarding the administrative or procedural status of the proceedings. We have established a special email address to receive those types of communications at lookoutslew@deltacouncil.ca.gov. I strongly recommend that if you find yourself anywhere that Lookout Slew and or the council's appeals proceedings become a topic of conversation, please excuse yourself from that meeting immediately by explaining you are under an ex parte communication prohibition and cannot discuss or hear any extra record information about the project. If you receive a request from someone other than a council employee to discuss Lookout Slew, please decline that request and make Executive Officer Jessica Pearson and me aware of that request so that we can handle it appropriately. Do you have any questions?
Looks like no questions from the council. Thank you very much, Vera.
Thank you.
I'll now ask council staff to provide a staff report, and following the staff report, we'll provide additional information regarding how the parties and public may address the council on this item. Good morning, Jeff.
Good morning, Chair Tatayan. Just confirming everyone can hear me.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. We'll go ahead and proceed with the staff report. Good morning, Chair Tatayan. Good morning, council members. Good morning to those who've joined us today. This is the public hearing regarding appeals of the certification of consistency for the Lookout Slew Tidal Habitat Restoration and Flood Improvement Project. Next slide, Brandon. So today we're going to provide in our staff report an overview of the council's covered action authority and process. We'll summarize the staff report and proposed determination that council members received ahead of this hearing, and we'll provide a bit of staff analysis to support the staff recommendation, as well as review the staff's draft recommendation with regard to the appeals. And just in summary, that recommendation is that staff would recommend that the council adopt the proposed determination, which contains findings both remanding the matter in part to the department and denying the appeals in part. Next slide. By way of background, the 2009 Delta Reform Act established the co-equal goals for the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta. And those co-equal goals are to provide a more reliable water supply for California and protect, restore, and enhance the Delta ecosystem. Importantly, those co-equal goals need to be achieved in a manner that protects and enhances the unique cultural, recreational, natural resource, and agricultural values of the Delta as an evolving place. The Reform Act also charges the council to implement the Delta Plan. And the Delta Plan is a comprehensive resource management plan for the Delta and Sassoon Marsh. As part of this charge, the council has regulatory and appellate authority over certain state and local public agency plans, programs, and projects in the Delta and Marsh to ensure that they're consistent with the Delta Plan. We refer to these as covered actions. The Delta Plan includes 17 regulatory policies, which are adopted to meet objectives the legislature said in statute were inherent within the co-equal goals. And an agency that's carrying out, approving, or funding a covered action in the Delta must demonstrate that action's consistency with Delta Plan policies. Next slide, Brandon. Agencies demonstrate consistency with the Delta Plan by submitting to the Council a written certification of consistency with detailed findings as to whether its covered action is consistent with the Delta Plan. Any person who claims that a proposed covered action is inconsistent with the Delta Plan, and as a result of that inconsistency would have a significant adverse impact on the achievement of one or both of the co-equal goals, or implementation of government-sponsored flood control programs to reduce risks to people and property in the Delta, may appeal the certification of consistency no later than 30 days after the submission. That appeal must include specific factual allegations. Both written certifications and appeals are typically submitted online on the Council's website, along with supporting documents, notices, and public comments received. And for reference, that website is coveredactions.deltacouncil.ca.gov. Next slide, please. The Council must hold a hearing on the appeal within 60 days of the date of filing of the appeal, unless it is determined that the issue raised on appeal is not within the Council's jurisdiction or does not raise an appealable issue. We held the required hearing for this matter on May 20th and 21st, 2021. Also, the Council must make a decision regarding appeals within 60 days of the hearing. We're gathered here today and tomorrow to consider such a decision. And the Reform Act and the Council's appeals procedures provide options for the Council to deny the appeals, in which case the certifying agency would proceed with implementation, to remand the matter to the lead agency for reconsideration. If the agency then decides to proceed with the action as modified to respond to the findings of the Council, the agency would file a revised certification of consistency addressing the Council's findings prior to proceeding with that action. And the Council or executive officer may also dismiss appeals that raise non-appealable issues, are outside the Council's jurisdiction, or that fail to provide the required specificity to support the appellant's claims. Next slide, please. In reviewing the certification and appeals, the Council applies what is known as the substantial evidence standard of review. And under that standard, the Council must make specific written findings, either denying the appeal or remanding the matter based on the finding that the certification of consistency is not supported by substantial evidence in the record before the agency that filed the certification. When we talk about substantial evidence, we're describing evidence that is reasonable in nature, credible and of solid value, and includes facts, reasonable assumptions predicated upon facts, and expert opinions supported by facts. Speculation or conjecture alone is not substantial evidence. And the Council reviews a certification to determine whether it is supported by the administrative record, rather than simply reviewing it for error. The entire record is reviewed, including evidence that would detract from the decision. The Council does not substitute its own findings or inferences for that of the department. And in these appeals, the appellant carries the burden of demonstrating that the administrative record does not contain sufficient evidence to support the department's findings. Next slide, please. With regard to the covered action we're considering today, again, this is the Lookout Slew project. The lead agency for the action is the Department of Water Resources, which we'll refer to throughout the hearing and in the proposed determination as the department. It would involve restoration of 3,165 acres of tidal wetland habitat located in the Delta within the Cache Slew complex in unincorporated Solano County. And it would also create 40,000 acre feet of transitory flood storage within the complex. And according to the department in its certification, the action is intended to provide habitat and food availability for wetland dependent species, intended to increase flood storage and conveyance, including the resilience of levees while reducing flood risk, and is necessary to partially fulfill requirements under the 2008 U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service biological opinion, the 2009 National Marine Fisheries Service biological opinion, and the 2020 LTO ITP. Next slide, please. The department submitted a certification of consistency to the council on February 22nd of this year. In its certification, the department identified that the Lookout Slew project is consistent with 10 Delta Plan regulatory policies, and that 7 policies do not apply to the project. And you'll hear more from representatives of the department today regarding their certification and the proposed determination. Next slide, please. The council also received 4 timely appeals from the following parties: Liberty Island Access, which we'll refer to as LIA, Solano County Water Agency, which we'll refer to as SCWA, Reclamation District 2060 and Reclamation District 2068, which are referred to throughout the proceedings as the districts, and Central Delta Water Agency, which is also referred to as CDWA. You will hear from each of the appellants during today's public hearing regarding their appeals and the proposed determination. Next slide, please. The appeals contend that the department failed to demonstrate substantial evidence within the record to support consistency with aspects of the 11 Delta Plan policies that are identified on the screen. The table on the screen also identifies which appellants appealed each policy. Next slide, please. For the record, I'll now describe the timeline for the appeals that has led us to today's hearing. On February 22nd, 2021, the department filed a certification of consistency for the project. On March 24th, 2021, the appeals received were deemed filed. On April 8th, 2021, the department certified the record for this matter as full and complete. On May 20th and 21st, 2021, the council held a hearing on these appeals. On June 18th, 2021, the council released a staff draft determination for a 10-day public review and comment period. On June 23rd, 2021, the council provided notice for today's hearing. On June 28th, 2021, the council received comments on the staff draft determination from parties and interested persons. And on July 2nd, 2021, the council released the proposed determination for public review and discussion at today's hearing, along with a staff report for the matter and a notice of the public hearing. Oh, I'm sorry, the notice for the public hearing was published on June 23rd, 2021. Next slide, please. A bit regarding evidentiary requests that we have received and considered in this matter. As we noted on previous slides, the council's findings must be based on substantial evidence in the record established for this matter, and the department certified that record as full and complete on April 8th, 2021. The council's appeals procedures do allow that we may submit or we may supplement the agency's record submission with any information we conclude was before the agency, but nevertheless was not included in the submission to us. And that's under our appeals procedures section 10. We may also take official notice of any accepted technical or scientific fact, as well as any fact that may be judicially noticed by courts of California. And that's within our appeals procedures section 29. The department and appellants, LIA, SCWA, and CDWA, all requested that additional documents be added to the record. The department has also objected to certain of those requests for admissions. In addition, the department has objected to the contents of appellants' written submissions and hearing presentations on the grounds that they contain extra record evidence. In addition to these requests, all of the parties, including the department, as well as the Delta Protection Commission, have cited to extra record evidence in their written and oral presentations to the council. When appropriate, the council has evaluated whether to supplement the record or to take official notice of this evidence pursuant to the appeals procedures section 10 and 29. Our recommended rulings, staff's recommended rulings on these requests are provided in exhibits A, B, and C to the proposed determination. Documents to be admitted pursuant to section 10 are in exhibit A. Those to be admitted pursuant to section 29 are listed in exhibit B, and documents that we would decline to admit into the record are listed in exhibit C. These exhibits were included in the June 18th staff draft determination, and the parties were invited to submit additional information by June 28th to address any deficiencies or objections. The department objected to proposed additions to exhibits A and B. The commission objected to one of the items we declined to admit into the record. The changes in the proposed determination reflect staff's review and consideration of these comments related to the exhibits and evidentiary requests. Next slide, please. So now there are 4 types of recommended findings that are contained in the proposed determination related to individual Delta Plan policies and issues that were identified by appellants within these policies. By adopting the proposed determination, the council would do 4 things: dismiss non-appealable issues, issues that are outside the council's jurisdiction, and issues where appellants failed to provide required specificity. The council would deny appeals based on policies that do not apply to the covered action. The council would remand the matter in part to the department because appellants showed that the certification is not supported by substantial evidence in the record. And the council would deny the appeals in part because appellants failed to show that the certification is not supported by substantial evidence in the record. We'll review the details of each of these types of findings for the balance of this presentation, beginning with the issues for which staff recommends the council dismiss the appeals. Next slide, please. This first set of issues would be dismissed as non-appealable issues and issues outside the council's jurisdiction under Water Code Section 85225.2 and the council's appeal procedures Section 15C. These include issues under DPP2 and RRP1 regarding the allocation of Proposition 1 funds, issues under DPP2 regarding disproportionate impacts and demographic considerations, issues under DPP2 related to Delta Plan Recommendation DRR11, which recommends but does not require that water management and ecosystem restoration agencies should provide recreation opportunities at new facilities and habitat areas whenever feasible. Issues under DPP2 related to the Davis-Dahlwig Act, which requires that planning for public recreation use in conjunction with state water projects be part of the project formulation process. Issues under ERP2 regarding alternate sea level rise projections. Issues under ERP2 regarding propagation of predatory fish species, and issues under RRP1 regarding lack of a detailed funding plan for operations and maintenance, capital funding, and on-site personnel to ensure facility maintenance and manage flood risk. The second set of issues would be dismissed because appellants failed to provide the required specificity to support their claims under Water Code Section 85225.10C and Appeals Procedures Sections 6E and F and 15C. These issues were raised by SCWA and the districts under GP1B4 adaptive management and include operations and maintenance and third-party verification, operations and maintenance of the Duck Slew setback levy, funding to provide for operation, maintenance, repair, replacement, and rehabilitation, or OMRR&R, and design aspects and maintenance facilitation of the Cache and Haas Slew levy. Next slide, please. The second set of recommended findings consists of 4 policies that the department in its certification finds do not apply to the covered action, where appellants claim that they do apply. Staff recommends that the council find that these policies do not apply to the covered action and then deny these appeals under Water Code Section 85225.25 for the following reasons. With regard to policy GP1B1 for the co-equal goals, the department has not identified an inconsistency with any Delta Plan policy, and GP1B1 requires that covered actions be consistent with all applicable Delta Plan policies, not that covered actions must also show compliance with the co-equal goals. With regard to WRP1, reduced reliance, this policy applies to water suppliers, and 1 or more water suppliers would not receive water as a result of the proposed action. With regard to WRP2 related to transparency and water contracting, The project description does not identify amendments to an SWP or CVP contract that would be subject to WRP2, and WRP2 does not address performance issues under existing contracts. And then with regard to ERP1 delta flow objectives, ERP1 would apply only to projects that could significantly affect flow in the delta. And the department provides and cites to evidence in the record that the covered action would not significantly affect flow in the delta or cause a violation of the existing flow standard D1641. Next slide, please. The third set of findings addresses two issues under policies GP1B3 for best available science and DPP2 respect local land use that relate to recreation. Staff recommends that the council find that appellants demonstrated that the department's certification of consistency is not supported by substantial evidence in the record and remand the matter to the department for reconsideration on these issues under Water Code Section 85225.25. I'll now ask Karen Kafetz to address our recommended best available science finding on this issue. And Karen will be followed by Avery Livingood, who will address our recommended DPP2 finding on this issue. Karen?
Yeah. Next slide, please. Thank you. So GP1B3 is the council's policy on best available science. And this policy requires that all covered actions document the use of best available science as relevant to the purpose and nature of the project. Delta Plan Appendix 1A provides guidance on the application of best available science and provides descriptions for six criteria of best available science. These criteria are relevance, inclusiveness, objectivity, transparency and openness, timeliness, and peer review. One of the issues that LIA raises in their appeal is related to the calculation of current recreational usage of the project site. And for this issue, they implicate the inclusiveness criterion of the best available science policy. The inclusiveness criterion requires that scientific information used shall incorporate a thorough review of relevant information and analyses across relevant disciplines. The record shows that the department had information about the 1 hour driving radius from the project site, which they used to analyze alternative recreational facilities, and that the department had access to census tract data, which they used for estimating recreational usage on a single census tract relative to the project. However, the department did not use this information together to estimate recreational usage of the project site. Failure to meet the inclusiveness criterion may have led the department to not fully consider the effects of the covered action on recreational usage. And we conclude that LIA has showed the certification is not supported by substantial evidence in the record as it relates to the inclusiveness criterion. Staff therefore recommends the council remand the matter to the department for reconsideration of this issue. I'll hand it off now to Avery.
Thanks, Karen. Good morning, council members. Policy DPP2 requires in part that covered actions be cited to avoid or reduce conflicts with existing uses when feasible. The department certified that the Lookout Slew project is consistent with DPP2. Appellant LIA alleged that the project was not cited to avoid or reduce conflicts with existing recreational uses of Liberty Island Road, the Shag Slew Bridge, and Liberty Island Ecological Reserve, such as bank fishing and hand launching of kayaks. The record contains evidence that there are existing recreational uses at Liberty Island Road, Shag Slew Bridge, and Liberty Island Ecological Reserve. The record lacks evidence that the Lookout Slew project would not conflict with these existing uses, with the removal of the existing land-based access route to the Liberty Island Ecological Reserve. The staff analysis finds that Liberty Island access showed that the certification is not supported by substantial evidence in the record that recreational uses of Liberty Island Road, the Shag Slew Bridge, and Liberty Island Ecological Reserve do not constitute existing uses. LIA showed that the certification is not supported by substantial evidence in the record that the covered action would not conflict with these existing recreational uses. And LIA showed that the certification is not supported by substantial evidence in the record that the department avoided or reduced conflicts with these existing recreational uses when citing the Lookout Slew project. We did not reach a conclusion regarding the issue of whether citing the Lookout Slew project to avoid or reduce conflicts with these existing uses was feasible, as explained on the slide and in the proposed determination. Therefore, staff recommends that the council remand the matter to the department for reconsideration of the issue. I'll now hand it back to Jeff.
Thank you, Avery. Beyond the recommended remand issues that Karen and Avery summarized, appellants identified numerous additional policies and appeal issues that council staff considered relative to the record established for this matter. For these items, staff recommends that the council find that appellants failed to demonstrate that the certification is not supported by substantial evidence and deny the appeals under Water Code Section 85225.25. These include findings related to GP1B2 for mitigation measures, ERP2 to restore habitats at appropriate elevations, GP1B3, best available science with regard to issues other than recreational use analysis, GP1B4 with regard to adaptive management. Next slide, please. ERP5, avoiding introductions of and habitat improvements for invasive non-native species. DPP2, respect local land use as to all other issues other than the existing recreational access issue that Avery summarized previously. And RRP1, prioritization of state investments in delta levees and risk reduction. I'll now ask Dan Constable, Karen Kafetz, Martina Kohler, Avery Livingood, and Ryan Stambra in order to summarize our recommended findings on these issues. Dan?
Thank you, Jeff. I'll give an overview of recommended findings for two policies. First, for GP1B2 for mitigation measures. This policy requires, in relevant part, that covered actions not exempt from the California Environmental Quality Act, or CEQA, include all applicable feasible mitigation measures that are adopted and incorporated into the Delta Plan, unless those measures are within the exclusive jurisdiction of another agency, or they've included substitute mitigation measures that the agency, in this case DWR, the department, finds are equally or more effective. 3 appellants appealed 10 Delta Plan mitigation measures related to 6 thematic areas as noted here. Next slide, please. The analysis and recommended proposed findings are described in detail in the proposed determination starting on page 23. However, I'd like to highlight 3 mitigation measures specifically due to their relevance to DPP2, where there is a recommendation to remand. First, for Delta Plan mitigation measures 18.1 and 18-2, appellant LIA does not identify a significant impact to a designated recreational facility as a result of the Lookout Slew project. This is important because the mitigation measure specifically notes that there has to be a designated facility, and LIA has failed to show that the project mitigation measures 18.1 and 18.2 are applicable to the Lookout Slew project for this reason. Second, for Delta Plan mitigation measure 19.1, there is substantial evidence in the record to show that there are no impacts to traffic or circulation that require mitigation as described under this mitigation measure, and thus this mitigation measure is not applicable. And for these reasons, staff recommend that the council deny the appeals as to these issues. Next slide, please. For Delta Plan Policy ERP2, restore habitats at appropriate elevations. This policy is discussed in detail starting on page 88 of the proposed determination. However, to paraphrase, the policy requires that for projects that include a habitat restoration component, the habitat restoration must be carried out consistent with Appendix 3 of the Delta Plan, and that Appendix 4 of the Delta Plan, which is an elevation map, should be used as a guide for determining appropriate habitat restoration actions based on an area's elevation. And if there's a proposed habitat restoration action that is not consistent with Appendix 4, the proposal shall provide a rationale for the deviation based on best available science. One appellant, CDWA, raised two primary assertions under this policy. First, that the project site would be inundated with future sea level rise. And second, that the entire site is not completely within intertidal habitat range. I should note that CDWA also asserted that the covered action is inconsistent because of alternate sea level rise projections and that it would propagate predatory fish species. However, as Jeff noted, these issues are discussed in a separate section as not relevant to this policy. However, for the inserted inconsistencies mentioned, staff found that the department has cited evidence in the record the project site is at elevations appropriate for intertidal habitat range as appropriate for tidal marsh restoration. And specifically, ERP does not include a requirement that a project be completely within the intertidal habitat range. Instead, ERP2 only requires that Appendix 4 be used as a guide, and it allows deviation from it if there's a rationale based on best available science. The department provides evidence in the record that the majority of the project site is at appropriate elevations, and it cites to the specific elevations in the record. And therefore, staff recommends that council deny the appeal as to these issues. Next slide, please.
Thanks. As I spoke to previously, GP1B3, the best available science policy, requires documentation of the use of best available science, and Delta Plan Appendix 1A provides 6 criteria of best available science. In addition to the issue I spoke to earlier, LIA also raised additional issues with the methods used to estimate recreational usage, implicating the criteria of objectivity and relevance. Staff did not find that LIA has shown the certification does not meet these criteria, and staff recommends the council deny appeal as to those issues. SCWA, the districts, and CDWA raised several issues related to the department's methods used to analyze, model, and review water quality impacts, listed on the slide, implicating many different best available science criteria. In each of these cases, we find the appellants have not shown the department's methods fail to meet the criteria, and staff recommends that the council deny appeal as to these issues. Next slide, please. GP1B4, adaptive management, requires that covered actions include adequate provisions appropriate to the scope of the covered action to assure continued implementation of adaptive management, which includes both an adaptive management plan as well as documentation of access to adequate resources and delineated authority to implement the proposed adaptive management plan. SCWA alleges that the department failed to provide documentation of adequate resources and delineated authority to implement adaptive management. We find that the department's certification cites to substantial evidence of adequate resources through the Fish Restoration Program Agreement contract terms, specifying that the State Water Project is financially responsible for adaptive management of the covered action. Further, the Adaptive Management and Monitoring Plan and the Fish Restoration Program Agreement both describe the department's delineated authority to implement adaptive management. Staff recommends that the council deny appeal as to these issues. Next slide.
The ERP5 policy requires that introductions of and improved habitat conditions for non-native invasive species are fully considered and avoided or mitigated. This policy applies if there is a reasonable probability of the covered action to introduce or improve habitat for non-native invasive species. In the certification, the department finds ERP5 not applicable. The appellants raise issues under this policy, specifically not fully avoiding or mitigating for non-native fish, such as predatory striped bass, and for the aquatic vegetation, such as water hyacinth. And then the issue of dedicated funding for a designated on-the-ground program to control the aquatic weeds. Staff analysis shows the record support the ERP5 applies to the covered action. For the specific issues, the record shows non-native fish were considered and avoided in the project by designing the levee bridges to be large and wide to avoid creating predation hotspots. Record shows invasive vegetation is avoided with mechanical and chemical control prior to the construction. After the construction, invasive vegetation and aquatic weeds will be monitored and managed for compliance and effectiveness performance standards as defined in the adaptive management and monitoring plan and the project long-term management plan. The department provides a record of an interagency contract and funding for the division of boating and waterways to establish the dedicated invasive aquatic vegetation control program. In conclusion, the substantial evidence in the record shows the covered action is consistent, and therefore the staff recommendation is to deny the appeals under this policy. Next slide, please.
Thank you. Policy DPP2 requires that projects be cited to avoid or reduce conflicts in part with existing uses, as I mentioned earlier, and also with the uses described or depicted in city and county general plans when feasible. The department certified that the Lookout Slew project is consistent with DPP2, and 3 appellants, the Solano County Water Agency, the districts, and the Central Delta Water Agency, allege that the project does not avoid or reduce conflicts with a variety of existing and planned uses, ranging from existing agricultural uses to existing physical infrastructure, including water intakes, as well as uses identified in the Solano County General Plan and the Solano County Climate Action Plan. There's a detailed analysis of each of these issues beginning on page 99 in the proposed determination. Having analyzed each of these issues and the evidence in the record, staff find that the appellants have failed to show that the certification is not supported by substantial evidence in the record. The covered action is consistent with DPP2 with regard to these issues. Therefore, staff recommends that the council deny the appeals as to these issues. Next slide, please.
Thank you, Avery. RRP1 requires a project that involves discretionary state investments in Delta flood risk management to demonstrate consistency with the goals and objectives identified in the policy related to localized flood protection, levee network, and ecosystem conservation. The policy also states that the 9 goals identified in RRP1 are all important, and it is expected that over time, the department balance achievement of those goals. Next slide. The department certified consistency with 7 of the 9 RRP1 goals. Specifically, this included all 3 goals from the levee network and ecosystem conservation priorities, and goal number 2 under the localized flood protection priority related to the protection of small communities and critical infrastructure of statewide importance. While appellant CDWA asserts that the flood protection benefits provided by this covered action are not sufficient to demonstrate consistency with goal number 2 under the localized flood protection priority, no appellant disputes the covered action's consistency with the goals listed under the ecosystem conservation or the levee network priorities. Given that RRP1 does not require a covered action to address every goal and objective identified in the policy, staff recommends that the council deny the appeal as to this issue. Next slide.
Thank you, Ryan. So having completed the process required by Water Code Section 85225 for the appeals, the council is required to make findings on the appeals pursuant to the Water Code. In making the findings, the council may consider adopting the proposed determination for the Lookout Slew project following conclusion of this public hearing. Staff recommends that the council adopt the proposed determination contained as attachment 1 to your staff report, and the findings contained therein regarding appeals of the department's certification of consistency for the Lookout Slew project, certification number C20215, inclusive of any modifications directed by the council that may be read into the record of today's proceedings. The council may make the findings required by section 85225.25 by taking action to adopt the proposed determination as presented or as modified by the council following the hearing, or by not adopting the proposed determination and making separate findings. So the staff recommendation specifically is that based on the analysis and findings in the proposed determination, staff recommends that the council, 1, adopt the proposed determination and the findings contained therein, and 2, remand the matter in part to the department for reconsideration on the issues identified for remand under Delta Plan policies GP1B3 and DPP2 as set forth in the proposed determination, because the certification was not supported by substantial evidence in the record, and this would be pursuant to Water Code section 85225.25. And 3, deny the appeals in part on the issues recommended for denial as set forth in the proposed determination, pursuant to Water Code section 85225.25. And 4, dismiss the appeals on the issues recommended for dismissal as set forth in the proposed determination, pursuant to Water Code section 85225.10C and Appeals Procedures section 6E and F and 15C. Next slide, please. This concludes staff's presentation. Thank you, and we're happy to address any questions from the council. Chair Tatayan.
Thank you, Jeff, and thank you to the whole team. Don.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. I just could I seek a clarification going back to the slide on ERP5. If we could bring that back up for a second.
Oh, just 1 second, sorry.
Sure. Yes, there. Thank you, Brandon. My question is, in the staff analysis, just to help me understand the 2 bullets on the findings. If I read those out loud, which I don't need to do, but there's double negatives in there. And in one first bullet, you say appellant showed. And then in the second bullet, we say appellants failed to show. Could somebody explain that?
I'm happy to, and would also invite Martina Kohler to address the matter if she has anything to add.
Okay.
There are 2 findings here, essentially, and kind of avoiding the double negative for the moment.
Okay, right. Yeah, that was catching me, Jeff. You got the double
avoiding
negative.
the double negative for the moment.
Okay.
The finding is essentially 1, that ERP5 does indeed apply to the covered action, and 2, that the certification is supported by substantial evidence that it's consistent. Again, just taking out the double negative for the moment. And it's worth noting, our standard of review on the substantial evidence standard makes it kind of difficult to avoid these double negatives at times. But I'm happy to kind of help straighten those out where it's necessary.
No, you did it very succinctly and have answered my question. So thank you very much. Thanks, Madam Chair. I understand.
Certainly.
Chair Tatayan, this is Daniel.
Hi, Daniel.
Hi. I'm kind of stuck on what I think I heard the team saying. Thank you, by the way, for the thorough walkthrough. But I'm a little befuddled by what I think I heard, in that the department did identify census tract data, but then did not apply it, if I heard you correctly, to the issue of the recreational use. Did I hear that right? And if so, or if not, can you elaborate on that a bit, please?
I think that's generally correct, but I would ask Karen Kafetz to help address that matter.
Yeah, so in this case, LIA's appeal pertained to the way that recreational usage was being calculated by the department, and specifically on the issue where we are recommending remand, we looked at what the department had presented us with, and we saw that there was evidence in the record that they had information available that could have been used to calculate an estimate of recreational usage using census tract data. They had demonstrated with other analyses that they had access to that data and to that information. And so we saw that there was evidence in the record that they could have been using that data. Yet the choices made by the department were to select just a single census tract that is touched by the project site. The project straddles 2 census tracts, and according to the department's own record, recreational usage extends beyond just the census tract that a project is in. They suggest that recreational users generally come from within a 1-hour driving radius. And they had used that 1-hour driving radius for another calculation as well. So we could see demonstrably they had access to that information, but then had not used that to calculate recreational usage using all of that census tract data. So that's why we considered that LIA's concern with it was valid. The department had the information in the record, but did not use it.
I might just add that, why that's important is because we're evaluating the inclusiveness criterion of best available science in this particular discussion, and that requires incorporation of a thorough review of relevant information and analyses across relevant disciplines. So I think in essence, it's a finding that the information was available and was in fact used for analyzing the recreational use of other project sites that would be potentially where recreational users from this site might be displaced to other sites, and that was used, that driving radius and the census data were used to evaluate that, but that similar data was not used to evaluate the demand for and use of the project site. So it's just a bit of an inconsistency between looking at the demand for this project site as well as looking at the potential displacement of users from this site in a parallel manner.
Thank you. And again, just to be very clear for my own benefit, that are you saying that even the single census tract data was not applied to the project site, or is our quarrel that they didn't use additional census tract data and additional data period?
Right. They used single census tract to calculate the estimate of recreational usage. So they did use that rather than using the census tract data for the 1 hour.
Got it. So our dispute is on this particular item is whether single census tract data is sufficient.
Right.
Thank you.
Sufficient to represent the potential use of the project site for recreation.
Yeah, the concern being that given the decisions that they made about what data they were using for this, that could change the order of magnitude of the calculation or of the result of that calculation, and could have had an effect on their further analysis.
Thank you.
Any other questions from council members? Okay, I don't see any hands. Then let's turn now to the process for today's hearing. The council's main role in today's hearing is to receive comments from the parties and the Delta Protection Commission on the proposed determination that contains staff's recommended findings regarding the appeals of the certification of consistency for the Lookout Slew project. Given the number of parties and the time allowed to each, today's hearing is reserved for oral presentations by the parties. Council members will have an opportunity to ask questions of the presenting party or the commission after each of their respective presentations has concluded. The hearing will resume tomorrow, Friday, July 16, 2021 at 9 a.m. and will start with public comment, followed by council questions, consideration of the proposed determination, and action to adopt findings pursuant to Water Code Section 85225.25. So Brandon or Beck, could you show the slide with information about public comment. So anyone who would like to provide oral public comment during the public comment period for the hearing, which is tomorrow, July 16th, needs to contact the council clerk via email at engage@deltacouncil.ca.gov or telephone at 916-798-9817 and provide their name and organization if applicable. Those requests to comment will be called by the council clerk to speak in the order these requests are received, and oral comments will be subject to a 3-minute time limit. Alternatively, comments may be dictated or emailed to the council clerk for the clerk to read aloud to council members during the public comment period for the hearing, which is tomorrow, July 16th. Written public comments will be read by the council clerk upon request, subject to the same 3-minute time limit as oral comments. If you would like to provide written public comment in advance of the hearing and have the council clerk read your comment during the public comment period, please include that request with your written comment and submit your comment electronically to engage@deltacouncil.ca.gov. So Brandon, I think we can remove the slide. To those representing the department, the commission, and the appellants here today to present on the Lookout Slew project appeals, please listen closely to the following instructions. Presenters speaking today will not be sworn in. This entire hearing will be recorded by an electronic reporter. The final transcript of the hearing and all written materials presented during the hearing will be shared with the service list and posted on the council's Lookout Slew project website as soon as it is available. If you're interested in purchasing final transcripts from the reporters, please coordinate that directly with them. The company name is California Reporting. Their telephone number is area code 510-224-4476. As with all public council meetings, this hearing is being webcast on the internet at www.cal-span.org, and the audio and video recordings will be available for later review. Council members, please hold your questions for each party until the conclusion of that party's presentation. At that point, I will open the opportunity for council member questions before proceeding on to the next party. Before we begin with oral presentations, I understand that council member Natoli would like to make a brief statement.
Yes, thank you, Chair Tatayan, and I want to just put a brief statement into the record and consistent with a previous statement I've made. My seat on the council is unique to among the members, and I'm seated as a member of the council because I currently serve as the chair of the Delta Protection Commission. And as a result, under the Delta Reform Act, I'm seated as a member of this council. The Delta Protection Commission has an interest in these proceedings, as we're all well aware, and the commission, by virtue of its establishment, has an advisory role to play pursuant to the Public Resources Code. As a result, the commission has sent communications to this body about proceedings and will present before the council a little later today. In order to judge these proceedings fairly and to honor the ex-parte communication prohibition, as well as to avoid any appearance of bias, I've taken the following precautions. Firstly, I've created an ethical wall separating myself from any Delta Protection Commission activities and communications relating to the Lookout Slew appeal once we went under ex-parte prohibition on March 22nd of this year. Examples of this are as the commission deliberates and has deliberated matters relating to Lookout Slew, I've recused myself and I've left the room. I've also taken no briefings from commission staff on Lookout Slew matters. In addition, I had no role in drafting, reviewing, or authorizing any commission correspondence to the council or anyone related to these proceedings. As a result, though it may not be clear from the commission's letterhead on the communications to this body, I am not a signatory to any document related to this matter from the commission and have not been since we went under ex parte communication restrictions, as I noted earlier, on March 22nd of this year. I take my participation as an impartial adjudicator in this matter seriously and believe it was important to state this for the record, not only for these proceedings, but for all future proceedings we will have on this matter. I look forward to a fair and impartial process for all the parties and participants, and thank you for allowing me to put this into the record. Back to you, Madam Chair. Thanks.
Certainly done. So thank you, Councilmember Natoli. We will now begin with oral presentations. I will call each presenter in order. If a presenter is not ready or available at the time they are called, they will forego their presentation. When you are called upon to speak, please state your name and identify the party you represent so that the court reporter may hear you and so that your comments are entered into the record and can be responded to appropriately. Please speak clearly and slowly to the court reporter, so the court reporter can understand and accurately record your comments into the record. So the order of opening presentations, Department of Water Resources will present, they'll have 40 minutes. Delta Protection Commission will have 10 minutes. Appellant A1, Liberty Island Access will have 10 minutes. Appellant A2, Solano County Water Agency, also 10 minutes. And Appellant A3, Reclamation District 2068 and Reclamation District 2060 will have 10 minutes. Appellant A4, Central Delta Water Agency will also have 10 minutes. So let's move to the Department of Water Resources.
Good morning, Madam Chair. This is Cindy Messer. I think I am up first. I think we have a presentation, so I can get going just for the sake of time, but when that's up, oh, perfect. And could we go ahead and move to the second slide? Great, thank you. So once again, my name is Cindy Messer. I am the lead deputy director for the California Department of Water Resources. And I will be providing some opening remarks this morning ahead of our whole series of presentations. I'd like to say good morning to the council and to thank you for your time this morning and for your consideration of this project. I'd also, before talking a little bit about the Lookout Slew project, I would like to offer our thanks to the Delta Stewardship Council staff. We recognize that this is a very large and complex project, and they have spent an enormous amount of time and energy and thoughtfulness over the last few months during the review as we've had appropriate communications and getting ready for the hearing that we are at today. So thank you to them. So let me touch a bit on the importance of the Lookout Slew project and quickly touch upon our consistency determination. So the Lookout Slew project is the largest tidal habitat project planned within the Delta. It is truly a multi-beneficial project, providing not only habitat for imperiled native species, but also critically needed flood improvements that protect thousands of acres of privately owned agricultural lands. It also helps to expand the Yellow Bypass to provide needed capacity during flood years. And in addition, this project does provide for some recreational opportunities in this unique area of the Delta. And we'll talk more about those in some of the subsequent presentations. This project does help to further the co-equal goals of water supply reliability and protecting, restoring, and enhancing the Delta's ecosystem while still protecting Delta as place values. The department firmly believes that our determination of consistency with the Delta plan for the Lookout Slew project is accurate, and it is supported by substantial evidence as presented in the administrative record before the council. So now I'd like to just switch gears a little bit and talk about the urgency of completing the Lookout Slew project. As you are all most definitely aware, the Delta has been subjected to loss of wetlands and tidal habitat ecosystems over time, to the tune of something like 98% loss. Project like Lookout Slew helps to recreate these types of habitats in this region. In addition, we are currently seeing record low abundance of many native fish species, including Delta smelt and winter run Chinook salmon, both of which are near extinction levels. And one of the items I'd point to on the slide that is before you is the Delta Smelt Abundance Index. We wanted to provide this as a quick visual to highlight this point. And as you can see, over the last few years, the capture of Delta smelt in the Delta region has been zero. And this obviously is a very long-term fisheries monitoring program. So these species are indeed imperiled. We are now also facing or in the midst of a second critically dry year in the state of California. And we are officially in the midst of another major drought event, with forecasts for this next year not looking much better. Projects such as the Lookout Slew project aim to restore critical wetlands that provide both habitat, but also support food web productivity throughout the Delta estuary. Both of these elements always important for species in the region, but increasingly more important as we find ourselves in these extreme climate conditions. Restoration projects like Lookout Slew have been called for in nearly every plan written for the Delta over the past 50 years. And this project is critical for the future of the region. It is a high priority for the Department of Water Resources and for the state as a whole. So the bottom line on this is that time is of the essence for improving ecosystem health in the Delta, and delays in critical projects such as the Lookout Slew project must be avoided in order to offset impacts from both long-term issues, for example, loss of wetlands, as well as extreme climate conditions that we currently find ourselves facing. So my last points, last but definitely not least, I would like to offer some information and some thoughts related to public access and recreation in the Delta. I'd like to touch on an emerging partnership that the department is involved in that is focused on public access within this region, and talk a bit about some next steps. So we as a department do recognize that there are limited recreational facilities and public access opportunities in the Cache Slough region and throughout the Delta. We are currently engaged in a partnership with Solano County and with the California Department of Fish and Wildlife to identify actionable recreational opportunities in the region. We will soon have a memorandum of understanding in place between our three organizations, consistent with and as described in letters submitted to the Delta Stewardship Council this week by Solano County and the Department of Fish and Wildlife. And this MOU proposes that a regional and collaborative approach to public access is the best way for us to move together collectively. The MOU will further commit us as the Department of Water Resources to working together with our partners, and will include a focused, stakeholder-driven process to help us identify those actionable recreational opportunities in the region. I would also note that the governor's office has expressed an interest in this project and describes that interest in a letter that they sent to the council this morning through your comment process. It should be acknowledged that in order to plan for an approach to public access and recreation for the Delta, that we need to involve a very broad stakeholder group, including those responsible for constructing, operating, and maintaining public access and recreational facilities, as well as local landowners who may have varying perspectives on access and varying ideas on how best to go to achieve that. This is a group that is larger than the one that's represented and made it before the council today during this proceeding. It would be a much broader stakeholder group. And the department is committed to convening and facilitating a robust stakeholder process and bringing this larger group together with our partners. We do believe this is the best way to develop a more holistic and regional approach to public access in the Delta, one that provides for safe, accessible, varied, and resilient recreation for the region. Lastly, we believe that it is entirely feasible to work on this regional approach to public access and recreation in parallel with constructing the Lookout Slew project, and the department is committed to doing both. So once again, I would like to thank the council for your time today, and I would reiterate that the department maintains that the Lookout Slew is indeed consistent with the Delta Plan and its goals, and that we have provided substantial information and evidence to support that. So with that, I will hand things over to Rachel Taylor, who will continue with our presentations. Thank you.
Thank you, Lead Deputy Director. Next slide, please. Good morning, Chair Tatayan, council members and staff. I am Rachel Taylor. I'm an attorney of the Department of Water Resources Legal Office. I would like to begin by echoing Cindy's comments and express our appreciation to the council and staff for their considerable efforts throughout this appeal process. We recognize reviewing a multi-benefit project of this size is not a simple task. Through the 4 appeals, 25 separate claims were made, of which only 9 have made it through to be considered applicable. DWR agrees with the staff determination on the 7 appeals recommended to be denied. We also sympathize with the comments made by the staff in the footnotes that some issues or facts were confusing, particularly during the oral testimony, as there were 6 different parties trying to cover 25 different issues within time constraints. For the limited time we have today, DWR plans to only focus on the 2 policies recommended to be remanded. We would note, however, that this in no way detracts from the importance of the other policies or testimony. This is first and foremost a tidal habitat restoration and flood improvement project. While we will be spending time on recreation, understand recreation is not the primary objective of this project. Secondly, DWR believes that we have met the substantial evidence standard to support our determination consistency on both policies. By focusing our presentation, we can clarify the thorough analysis and support that exists in the record. None of the information being presented today will be new. We do have some new visuals to assist in picturing the site based on the text and the records and the engineering designs, but everything has either been included in the administrative record or oral testimony at the hearings. So let us begin. The first question relates to GP1B3, best available science, as to the issues of methods to estimate recreational use as it relates to the criterion of inclusiveness. As noted in the slides from staff, the best available science criteria is listed in Appendix 1A of the Delta Plan. For inclusiveness, it states scientific information used shall incorporate a thorough review of relevant information and analysis across relevant disciplines. As noted in the questions, the staff is raising the issue of whether the size of census tract information used met the requirement for inclusiveness. Staff recommendation is to expand the sample size of census tracts to determine if that would change the number of estimated recreational uses at the Lookout Slew site. Problem with that recommendation is that inclusiveness is not about sample size or data collection. Inclusiveness looks across disciplines, and we believe that there is substantial evidence in the record to support the estimated usage. As stated in the Appendix 1A, the 6 criteria are based on the recommendations in the 2004 National Research Council Committee on Defining the Best Scientific Information Available for Fisheries Management, guidelines and criteria developed in order to apply best available science and natural resource management. These 2004 guidelines contain a longer definition for inclusiveness, which states that the goal should be to capture the full range of scientific thought and opinion on the topic at hand. Critiques and alternative points of view should be acknowledged and addressed openly. Anecdotal, experiential, narrative, or local information should be acknowledged and evaluated during the process of assembling scientific information. So that raises the question, did we meet the standard for inclusiveness? And we're going to argue yes. Our next 2 speakers are going to speak to that issue and demonstrate that this criteria was met by what was provided in the record. First will be Dr. John Boss, who has presented before and worked on developing the analysis for the Lookout Slew project. He'll be speaking as to what was used in the analysis and how it was used appropriately to estimate recreational usage. Second, we have Dr. David Roloff from Sacramento State University with us today, who is one of the authors of the surveys of recreational use in the Delta that we use as part of the base of the analysis. I would note that Dr. Roloff did not work on the Lookout Slew analysis and is not being asked here to present an opinion on the project. We invited him here to explain his research methods and how the scientific requirement of inclusiveness was addressed in his work. Next slide, please. And with that, I'm going to hand this over to Dr. Boss.
Thank you, Rachel. Good morning, members of the council. I'm John Boss. I'm a senior environmental planner with WR Environmental, and I am here representing the department. Today's hearing, I'm revisiting the issue of best available science as it applies to evaluating recreation for this project. During the May hearing, we heard from the Liberty Island Access appellant and learned of his efforts to count users and talk to people about their preferences for the reserve. And I understand from that presentation that for the appellant and those he represents, that recreation at the reserve is very important. I've also read the council's draft decision about remanding the project because recreation analysis does not meet the best available science criterion of inclusiveness. But I just want to point out there are other more specific criteria that pertain to doing scientific surveys of recreational visitors and assessing their preferences. Basically, there are two other criteria that we need to think about. One is the level of confidence that we can obtain the same result repeatedly, and the amount of error associated with that result, which in this case are the number of people that actually use the reserve for recreation. Because there's so much variation at the Liberty Island Ecological Reserve, the appellant did not collect sufficient information or use a probability-based sample, basically to give us the level of confidence and a low number, basically level of error about the number of people that use the reserve. So really what we can say based on the information we have is that there is some level of use that occurs at the reserve. I also want to point out that just in response to staff's report about the use of census tract data and population data, that kind of approach isn't really appropriate for estimating site-specific recreation use. That kind of approach is used to estimate recreation for large areas, usually for states, for multi-state regions, or for nations. And I'm on a bit of a time budget here today, so I won't go into more detail now, but I'm happy to answer more questions about that. But using that population level data really is much more appropriate for doing regional levels of recreation demand. So instead of doing our own survey, DWR elected to use 6 sources of data that were collected by federal and state agencies. And among those 6 that were all reputable and all meet the best, the 6 criteria for best available science, the most relevant one is, I believe, the 2017 Delta Boating Survey. And as Ms. Taylor mentioned, that is a study that Dr. David Roloff had worked on and is going to speak to. Basically, Dr. Roloff is going to talk about how it applies to inclusiveness. And I will say that study touches on the issue of visitors to the Shag Slough, Cache Slough area, and basically where they come from, what different residences they originate from. So at this point, I will turn that over to Dr. David Roloff.
Hi, thanks for inviting me. I want to reiterate, I'm a guest of the group that's working with DWR, and I'm here to represent the findings of the recreation studies that were done a few years back with the Delta Stewardship Council. I worked with a couple other colleagues who have fairly extensive recreation survey experience. And I also like to say that this is a notoriously difficult area to study in terms of social behaviors. So we rely on both probability sampling and non-probability sampling methods. And we developed a great appreciation for the Delta as a place for recreation, tourism, agritourism, all manner of different things that people do in their leisure time. So I'm here to just simply provide some perspective on the probability nature of some of the samples that we used for our study, but these were focused on boating, and the probability sample we were most proud of was the fact that we had the public, registered boaters in California. There are about 1 million registered boaters, and we were able to take a subset of those boaters from the primary and secondary areas of the Delta to ask them about how they use the Delta for recreation. We also studied in a non-probability approach, which means we didn't have sort of a systematic approach of everybody having an equal chance at participating in our study. We studied non-motorized boating, which was a much harder group to pin down. We used websites, local businesses related to Delta recreation to request visitors participate in a study, and we got quite a number of people to participate that way. Both studies, if my memory holds correct, used a map to have participants indicate where they traveled on recreation trips for boating to the Delta. And that's where you'll see in a moment, I think, some heat maps that were developed that indicate that use in particular in the area that you all are focusing on was from our sample standpoint, both non-probability and probability sample, the use was fairly light there. We did not study other recreation subgroups, but we did ask boaters what were the types of recreation that they participated in when they were in those areas, in particular, the area of question. We also, in some of our studies, used focus group methods, in particular with boating clubs in the area. And this is part of an acknowledgement that recreation subgroups sometimes simply can't be contacted through like a public, like their home addresses. And so we simply used social networks related to boating clubs and yacht clubs to contact them about their recreation patterns in the Delta, with the acknowledgement that probability samples, which means everybody has an equal chance of getting selected in a particular population, sometimes they don't include people. And we also acknowledge that when recreation use is very light, like it is in your area of concern, that recreation studies are very, very difficult to focus on particular subgroups. So the good news is the Delta Stewardship Council had, I think, some foresight in thinking ahead to wanting to have current recreation information on travel in the Delta. And again, I mean, our findings, which were related to boating recreation, suggest that recreation in this area is very light. And that also implies that it's very difficult to study and get a grasp on. I think that's about all I have to say. Thank you.
Okay, can we move the slide? Next slide. So this is just a summary for the testimony that was just provided. And then the next slide, please. Shows the heat map of the non-motorized boating use that was used as part of the 2017 study, as was just described. Next slide. Okay. So just as a summary, we believe that the analysis used for recreational usage meets all 6 of the criteria for best available science, including inclusiveness, and that the element of the appeal should be denied. As for respecting local land uses, reducing conflicts and feasibility, before discussing the substantial evidence standard in the record to support DWR's determination for consistency for this policy, we must address the staff statement, specifically that staff did not reach a conclusion regarding the issue of whether citing the Lookout Slew project to avoid or reduce conflicts of existing uses was feasible, because the certification is not supported by substantial evidence in the record that the department avoided or reduced conflicts with existing recreational uses of Liberty Island Road, the Shag Slough Bridge, and Liberty Island Ecological Reserve when citing the Lookout Slew project. That is not an option for the council. Per the Administrative Procedures, Section 14 and Water Code Section 85225.25, the council must make findings as to whether the certification of consistency is supported by substantial evidence in the record. The decision does not get to be deferred, nor does the staff have the opportunity to substitute their own judgment on the issue of feasibility. There's no process or option within the council's own regulations or law to defer determination of whether or not substantial evidence exists in the record to support DWR's determination of consistency on this policy. So for today, DWR is going to proceed to prove that there is substantial evidence in the record to support our determination of consistency on this policy. Per the staff determination, policy DPP2, there are 3 points to be addressed. First, in 1A, whether DWR documented the existing recreational uses on site. As noted in the June 28th letter, DWR has extensively described the existing recreational uses on site and included the Liberty Island Ecological Management Plan, which fully describes the different uses available, including shoreline fishing, bird watching, hunting, sightseeing, and kayaking, to name a few. Confusion appears to have been raised during the oral testimony, whether it was unclear if we were also being questioned about whether there are facilities or the level of recreational usage. The question about usage, we believe, has just been addressed in the best available science, and we believe that our analysis of the usage for that has been appropriately used. And that we've also appropriately documented all of the existing uses that are known in the area. Nothing has been raised in the appeals to support any existing uses not recognized within the record. So that element of the appeal should be denied. Secondly, under 1B, the staff report questions is whether the covered action would not conflict with existing recreational uses. They've broken down the policy, but the policy doesn't state that there can't be any conflicts. The policy asks whether we considered avoiding or reducing those conflicts when feasible. The answer there is also yes. DWR has extensively discussed the different design changes and iterative process developed to address existing uses. The Delta Plan defines feasible to mean capable of being accomplished in a successful manner within a reasonable period of time, taking into account economic, environmental, legal, social, and technical factors. We're going to put an emphasis on economic, environmental, legal, social, and technical. My colleague Bonnie Irving will be speaking in more detail on this point, but we do believe that this element of the appeal should also be denied. Third, on 1C, the staff report asks whether or not the department avoided or reduced those conflicts with existing recreational uses. And again, it goes to the extent feasible. My colleague Charlotte Biggs will discuss the recreational elements being addressed in the area, and that reduces conflicts and actually, frankly, improves the experience on site. Next slide, please. Before I hand it off, we wanted to clearly lay out the current site conditions, what was considered in the analysis, and the existing uses and lack of facilities that were a factor in determining the feasibility of avoiding or reducing or continuing those uses. There is one unavoidable conflict with the Lookout Slew project, and that is the loss of pedestrian access to Liberty Island Ecological Reserve. The staff report narrowly focuses on the impact of the loss of the bridge to recreational usage. We believe that is a misplaced focus. Loss of access to the bridge also impacted CDFW's ability to access Liberty Island for maintenance and enforcement. And the question was also raised during our development of the project about what that would do for emergency services. These issues were raised and discussed with CDFW and the County of Solano. Focusing only on what recreation played in those discussions dismisses the complexity of planning a project and ignores the other requirements of substantial evidence, that you look to the entire record to determine if the standard has been met. This decision was not made lightly and was made in consultation with area stakeholders, including those who operate and maintain the facilities in question. There are currently no recreational facilities at the site, as has been described in detail and documented in the record. That has not impacted the existing recreational uses on site. The project is going to add a facility, that of the boat ramp, and as I'll discuss, the other existing uses will also not be impacted. One of the many purposes of the boat ramp is to address the loss of bridge access for CDFW and emergency services and the general public launching small boats, which was a direct result of coordination with CDFW, the owner and operator of Liberty Island Ecological Reserve. The bridge is owned by Solano County and is being addressed through the road vacation process, which is the county's jurisdiction. To argue that because recreational usage alone should be a determinative factor on that conflict distorts the importance of recreation and undermines the necessity of addressing multiple concerns in citing a project. Next slide, please. As noted previously, there were multiple conflicts, whether real or perceived, with the siting of this project, including water quality, diversions, impacts to agricultural use, and flood impacts. All of that analysis, however, had to be viewed through the lens of the project objectives. At the end of the day, this project has to meet federal and state mandates, and they were not the same oversight agencies. Combining the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers requirements with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services and CDFW is no simple task. Any discussion of feasibility has to begin with the project objectives. And with that, I'm going to hand this over to Bonnie Irving.
Good morning, Chair Tatayan and council members. I'm Bonnie Irving, DWR Program Manager and the DWR Project Manager for Lookout Slew. As Rachel said, there are two primary goals for this project: tidal habitat restoration for compliance with biological opinions and the incidental take permit for continued operations of the State Water Project, and flood protection by building a new setback levee, creating over 40,000 acre-feet of flood conveyance to expand the Yellow Bypass. The design and development of this project was done over several years with extensive efforts to solicit public and agency comments on the design elements and use of science. Through iterative design drafts and multiple reviews, including public notices of 30 days for the 30% design, 60 days of public review and comment for the 60% design, and posting by the Army Corps of Engineers for 72 days, it was determined maintaining pedestrian access to Liberty Island Ecological Reserve was infeasible due to the project's overall goals of flood improvement and tidal habitat restoration to benefit native fish. Any additional delays to construct this complex 2 to 3 year construction project would delay Delta smelt recovery, which could lead to extinction of this species in the wild. This directly conflicts with the primary goals of the project. However, the design ultimately balances the project objectives with recreational uses by contributing significant recreational features, including the boat ramp, where no boat ramp exists today, and conversion of approximately 3,400 acres of private land to public land, including over 20 miles of open channels for the public to recreate. The boat ramp is a good example of recreation feature that was incorporated into the design based on feedback received through the iterative process and through soliciting comments on the project. In CDFW's February 12, 2020 comment letter, an agency boat ramp was requested to be incorporated into the design to provide CDFW monitoring access to the Lookout Slew channels and Liberty Island Ecological Reserve, and that CDFW was willing to let the public use this boat ramp to hand launch boats. In the final EIR, DWR committed to incorporating the suggested boat ramp into the final project design. Finally, DWR worked with CDFW staff and leadership to locate and design the ramp, thus avoiding conflicts for kayaking or other small watercraft. Next slide, please. And now I'm going to discuss a few infeasible design elements. Culverts were considered and discussed through the design of the project. DWR and consultants for the design have engineering and geotechnical subject matter experts that consider levee stability, soil conditions, and what would be needed for constructing culverts. However, it was determined that incorporating culverts across the proposed breaches would be infeasible with the project's flood improvement goals, as culverts cannot effectively route flood water into the Yolo bypass. In operation, culverts would become clogged with debris, which not only presents flood conveyance limitations, in addition to safety issues for boaters and kayakers, but would present significant operations and maintenance concerns that cannot be overcome. DWR has firsthand experience of this throughout the bypass, Delta, and Central Valley. Culverts are also infeasible from an ecological perspective based on the Fish Restoration Program implementation strategy, which is directly relevant to this project as this strategy was developed specifically for the Delta and for projects seeking credits from U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, National Marine Fisheries Service, and CDFW. Based on scientific literature, culverts are known to restrict fish movement, attract non-native fish predators, and restrict flow of water during seasonal flood events. Liberty Island Access's suggestion to build bridges across the 4 breaches north of the bridge to Liberty Island Reserve is infeasible, as we have demonstrated in the record, due to the instability of Shag Levee itself, as these photos on the slide demonstrate from the 2017 damage assessment reports. Soil conditions along Shag Slew would present great challenges in terms of current repairs needed to rehabilitate the levee, and then for design, permitting, and cost for construction, in addition to the long-term O&M. The current fragile levee is not designed for structural support, such as anchoring a slab concrete bridge across hundreds of feet for each breach. The existing access road that sits on top of the Shag Slew levee has questionable long-term sustainability, as our records show. Thus, investment in bridges would require significant investment in the levee itself. For example, in 2017, the levees in RD 2098 experienced an estimated $19.8 million in repairs alone, and would require additional funding in perpetuity, such as additional long-term operations and maintenance costs, and requirements for safety, inspections, and enforcement for preventing damages. Liberty Island Access does not have experience building or maintaining culverts or bridges, and their cost estimates are not accurate or informed by geotechnical conditions on the site, or the need to maintain these facilities in perpetuity. And now I'd like to hand it over to Charlotte Biggs for the next slide. Thank you.
Thanks, Bonnie. Good morning, Chair Tatayan and council members. I'm Charlotte Biggs, a program manager with DWR and our Eco Restore initiative. I want to take the next few minutes to walk through the specific recreational elements of and benefits of the Lookout Slew project. Our project creates a significant recreational opportunity in the Cache Slough region. It will convert over 3,000 acres of private property to public lands while preserving shoreline fishing access and creating new facilities and opportunities that do not exist today. I walked through some of these elements last time, but we had very limited time. So I'm hoping that going into more detail today, I can answer any remaining questions. Next slide, please. First, I want to highlight that the new wetland itself, stretching over 3,000 acres, will become an open waterway for the public to recreate. This creates over 20 miles of channels for boating, fishing, hunting, sightseeing, and bird watching. The channels extending across the site are nearly 2 miles long. Many of these channels intersect so that a boater or kayaker could spend all day exploring the waterways and wetlands of our site. The 9 breaches along Shag Slew are very large. In the south of the site, there is a breach over 600 feet wide. The 2 most northern breaches are 280 feet wide and 360 feet wide, which is shown in the inset on the right. These breaches are designed to be very large in order to convey daily tidal action across the entire site. These channels will be fully maintained for invasive species management. They will be deep and free of hazards. Unlike the open waters of Liberty Island, which have utility poles and other hazards, as it was an accidental breach. Next slide, please. The next feature I want to highlight is a new facility included in our design, which is the boat ramp. Currently, there are no formal facilities or boat launches on our site or at Liberty Island. The location of the new boat ramp is in the northeast corner of the site, directly south of Liberty Island Road, which is shown on the right of the slide. The boat ramp will be located 1/10 of a mile or 550 feet from the road. This boat ramp will be fully accessible to the public to hand launch small vessels and kayaks. The public can launch boats directly into the new channel to explore the wetlands, or they can have easy access to Shag Slew. Next slide, please. This is a rendering of the new boat ramp facility. The kayak and person are shown for scale. Again, it is 550 feet from the vehicle gate or the end of Liberty Island Road. I'm also showing an example of a boat ramp that DWR constructed last year, just to provide a visual. I want to stress that this is not a small facility. The boat ramp will be maintained by DWR as part of our maintenance of the project site. It will become a fully sanctioned recreational facility in the area where none exist today. Next slide, please. Another feature of the project is new pedestrian access. The new setback levee will connect to the Cash House levee and the cross levee system, creating over 6 miles where the public can hike and recreate. This pedestrian access provides the opportunity for shoreline fishing in the Haas Slew, which is shown on the eastern side of the project site. Haas Slew from this area is currently not accessible to the public as it is private property. So these 6 miles of channels will be wide, well-maintained, and provide a vantage point for sightseeing and bird watching along the sloughs and newly created wetland. Next slide, please. For access from Liberty Island Road, the project design creates 2 new paved turnaround areas that do not exist today. The first is shown here in the northwest corner of the project site, providing pedestrians access to the new setback levee and the ability to walk directly down to the Cash House levee and fish from Haas Slew. Next slide, please. The second turnaround area is shown here in the northeast corner of the project site. It's directly adjacent to Liberty Island Road and approximately 550 feet north of the new boat ramp. This slide also highlights where we are preserving shoreline fishing on the Shag Slew to the extent feasible with our project goals. LIA has claimed that our project will eliminate all shoreline fishing, and that simply is not true. Directly south of the new turnaround area at the end of Liberty Island Road, the public can still fish from the remaining Shag Slew levee. This area is called out in the light blue call-out box on the slide. Fishing will also be accessible past the gate along the D grade area, which is shown in brown. As a reminder, the D grade is there to convey waters during high water events, which we estimate will occur once every 5 years, only during certain winter months. Again, shoreline fishing will not be eliminated with this project. And as I've mentioned, new access to Haas Slew and the opportunity to fish in the wetland itself will be created by the project. Next slide, please. So this slide compares existing recreational opportunities at Liberty Island to what will be created on the Lookout Slew site. Liberty Island offers 3 miles of pedestrian access, which is shown in the photo at the top left. This access is along the remnant levee, which is very narrow and not maintained. Without maintenance, what is 3 miles today may not be 3 miles for long. The levee will continue to degrade and breach and be affected by sea level rise. So we compare this to the 6.3 miles of maintained levees that Lookout Slew will create. These levees will be wide, well-maintained, and account for climate change and flood. They will provide a vantage point to take in the open space and newly created wetland. To compare boat launch facilities currently on Liberty Island, which is shown on the bottom left, there are no maintained launching facilities. To launch a kayak, you would park along Shag Slough Levee, walk across the bridge to the interior of the site, which is about 0.2 of a mile. CDFW acknowledges in their management plan for Liberty Island that the bridge access may not be maintained in the future. The bridge to nowhere, as it's called, has structural issues and has a questionable future. We compare this to the new boat ramp facility that will be created at Lookout Slew, which I showed earlier. The Lookout Slew boat ramp is 0.1 of a mile from the turnaround area. It will be maintained and a sanctioned facility. The public will be able to use this to launch kayaks or boats into Shag Slough and use Liberty Island. So I've got only 1 minute left, so I'll switch to our closing. I wanted to draw your attention to something that we see as critical to this discussion. Earlier this week, the council received 2 letters, one from Solano County, the owners of Liberty Island Road and Shag Slough Bridge, and one from CDFW, the owners and operators of Liberty Island Ecological Reserve. Both letters urged the council to support the Lookout Slew project and move it forward without delay. Both letters recognize how DWR worked to balance the needs of recreation with the critical project goals of habitat restoration and flood protection. Both letters acknowledge the lack of recreation opportunities is a regional issue, not something that's been created by Lookout Slew, nor is it something that can be solved by Lookout Slew. And both letters underscore the importance of a collaborative process, one that includes local voices, including landowners, to create a more holistic approach to recreation in this area of the Delta. So together with Solano County and CDFW, DWR is committed to working with stakeholders to identify actionable recreation opportunities. We encourage the Delta Stewardship Council to support our partnership with Solano County and CDFW outside of this covered action to develop real solutions to this regional issue. We thank you very much for your time and consideration.
Council members, are there any questions for the Department of Water Resources representatives? Okay, I'm not seeing any hands raised. Then let's move on to the Delta Protection Commission for 10 minutes. Is the presenter for the commission ready here?
Just 1 second, he's being moved over.
Hello, this is Daniel.
Hi, Daniel.
Hi, sorry, I think I was on mute.
Oh, okay.
I just had a quick comment and question. First, I think I'm probably not alone in finding the underlying arguments for the project compelling and urgent. You know, my background before coming here was mostly in the executive branch. There were times when the specifics of the rules and regs didn't allow us to adequately address an urgent crisis. It was rare, but we would sometimes invoke extraordinary authority of the executive. And I'm assuming there is nothing at all comparable in a situation like this, where I think we all understand the urgency of the underlying goals of the project and its alignment with our mission, that would override are any more technical disputes that we have? And I guess it's a question both for the department and council staff. Thank you.
So Jeff, do you want to address the question?
On my way.
Yeah, sorry for that delay. We were taken out of the ability to speak.
Oh,
So
okay.
This is Rachel Taylor again, attorney with the Department of Water Resources. We understand the question of urgency was raised by several of the letters and by the presenters today, and it is one of those things that we're looking at for the impacts of continuing the process for additional study and how it would affect the project moving forward. But we also understand that you do have technical requirements of substantial evidence, which is why the bulk of our presentation was devoted to showing that we've actually met those requirements as well. So it is a balance between urgency and did we do our due diligence? And we understand that the burden is on us to show that we did our due diligence and that that is the first and foremost consideration. And we believe that we have met the substantial evidence, but we couldn't ignore the importance of the project or why it's timely or why those biological objectives really do need to be addressed at this time period. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. And I might add just a few things. There is no sort of authority overriding the Delta Reform Act, so that there is no, let's say, urgency clause or other type of authority that would override the act. Would also note, if this is as this is a project under CEQA, that also classifies it in part as a covered action. We would note that the department has not claimed a CEQA exemption for emergency purposes, which would be potentially the case if we were trying to move towards some sort of an urgency finding. And on remand, there are two things that the department would be able to avail themselves of to help move this forward as quickly as possible with regard to also working through a remand. One of those would be working with us to consider the feasible aspects or the feasibility analysis associated with DPP2. Would also note that the Delta Plan affords a lead agency the opportunity to utilize GP1B1, which could be to acknowledge that there may be some shortcoming with regard to the project relative to another Delta Plan policy, but that nevertheless it advances the co-equal goals. And as we mentioned in our analysis of GP1B1, to do that, the department needs to acknowledge that there is a potential inconsistency with another Delta Plan policy, because that's the means available to override, and that was not the case in this particular proceeding. And the urgency here wouldn't be supported by the record given the CEQA determination, but that's not a finding that we can make.
Virginia.
Thank you both.
Oh, excuse me, Daniel. I think I see Virginia's hand raised.
Thank you, Chair Tatayan. I think I just want to make a quick statement, and it goes to the comment that was just made right now with regard to the letters of support that have been submitted subsequently. And there's no question that this project, as has been mentioned in the presentation, it's a critical project. There's I guess I want to just make that clear. We all know that it is a critical restoration project for the Delta. And I think we all share in the desire to move this project forward and as quickly as possible, recognizing the need for this project to move forward. But I think we all can agree, or at least in my opinion, we cannot have this move as quickly as possible at the expense of the Delta Plan consistency. And so I think that's our job, is to provide, again, due process and to make evidence-based decisions on what is before us and what has been presented in the record, and evaluating, again, the future of promises of consistency is not what we should be doing. So again, with what's before us, I think executing restoration projects like this is clearly an important part of implementing the Delta plan, but they have to happen in a way that respects, again, the co-equal goals. And I just want to make sure that that's, clearly stated. And recreation is obviously a very, very critical component of Delta as place. So just want to put that on the record as well.
Thank you, Virginia. So before we move to the Delta Protection Commission, listening to Department of Water Resources presentation and then the questioning, I want to ask, just for clarification, so on page 99 of the determination, proposed determination, the recommendation, the remand, the matter, item 10, it's the three letters under item 1. So item 1 says we remand the matter to the department for reconsideration of the following issues. LIA has shown that certification is not supported by substantial evidence in the record that recreational uses of Liberty Island Road, Slew Bridge, and Liberty Island Ecological Reserve do not constitute existing uses. So I have to agree with Don or whoever it was that said that these double negatives are challenging. And then in item B, LIA has shown the certification is not supported by substantial evidence in the record that the covered action would not conflict with existing recreational uses of Liberty Island Road, Slew Bridge, and the reserve. And LIA has shown certification is not supported by substantial evidence in the record. The department avoided or reduced conflicts with existing recreational uses on Liberty Island Road, Slew Bridge, and the reserve when citing the project. So as I listened to the DWR presentation, I fully appreciate the complexity of this project and what it took to get to this stage. And I'm meaning permits and outreach and design and planning and more outreach. I understand the process, and this is a fabulous project. If someone could point me to somewhere in the record, I appreciate, especially Charlotte, the going into all of DWR's testimony, and it was very helpful to see the visuals of the boat ramp. But I think what the council needs here is very specific wording somewhere in the record that was before the department that would demonstrate that these points on page 99 are not accurate. Is there some page or some document, or I have stacks of documents all around me. I just don't know where to look for the specific wording that would demonstrate it is in the record, that these statements on page 99 are inaccurate.
So this is Rachel Taylor again from the department. A lot of it's in the June 28th letter in that section, but we can pull it out and give you just a succinct list of where all the specific references are, if you would grant us the ability to give that to you by tomorrow morning.
Well, I do. So actually, thank you, Rachel. I've read the June 28th letter 3 times, and I have scribbled notes all over it. Is there by chance so there is on page 5 of the June 28th letter, a paragraph about halfway down. The loss of shoreline fishing for pedestrians at the reserve is small in comparison to the other opportunities in the Delta for fishing from a bank or pier. Therefore, impacts of the proposed project would not exceed the applicable threshold of significance related to a decrease in opportunities to fish from the shoreline within the Delta region. And the proposed project's impact with regard to this threshold would be less than significant. And the note I've scribbled next to that paragraph is Is this substantial evidence that the department is avoiding or reducing conflict with existing uses?
So I think part of that question comes also into the project design. And that was part of why and this is one of those things we recognize, that our environmental documents are written to support the project objectives. And because recreation wasn't a key focus of that, it got lost. So what Charlotte was doing was pulling up, if you look at the 100% basis design, to see what the actual physical features are in the project design that we studied for and did the analysis of the impacts for. All of those features are there. They just weren't necessarily called out as recreational because that wasn't the focus of the environmental document at the time we did it. So that's partly why Charlotte's was going back over what the design features of the project were to show how all of that plays into looking at it from the recreational aspect.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Are there any other questions from council members? Let me see here. Is Daniel unable to raise his hand since he's on the phone? Daniel, did...
sorry, took the time. He can if he presses *9.
Okay.
Can you hear me, Susan? I think I am able to, yes.
Yes, thank you, Daniel. Well, then let's move on to Delta Protection Commission. And I think by now, maybe their technology has given the commission ability to present.
Good morning, Chair Tatayan and council members. I'm Eric Vink. I'm the Executive Director of Delta Protection Commission, and I thank you for the opportunity to provide comment both on behalf of the commission, but also speaking for the people who live in and love the Delta region and those who seek to protect and enhance the unique Delta values, and that's agricultural, cultural, recreational, and natural resource values. And I want to start by thanking the council staff for its thoughtful and thorough review of the record and for the conclusion it reached that the proposed Lookout Slew project is not consistent with the Delta Plan. The Delta Plan does not exist solely to accomplish water supply reliability or Delta ecosystem restoration. It strives to accomplish these co-equal goals in a manner that protects and enhances the unique Delta values, including recreation. This is the law. The Delta Plan, as council members are aware, was painstakingly crafted to achieve this balance nearly a decade ago. And as a consequence, it should be respected by project proponents. As the council's 5-year review of the Delta Plan found, people who live, work, and recreate in the Delta feel that they lack sufficient representation in the council's deliberations. These people rely upon the council to ensure that this appropriate balance is achieved. This balance cannot always be delivered by the environmental review process, as is apparent by the Lookout Slew project, where DWR and its EIR did not consider an alternative that would preserve existing recreation uses at the site, and where it did not effectively engage people whose recreation activities would be harmed by the project execution. So while we endorse the outcome of the draft determination, there are 2 specific concerns the commission has with that determination, and I would like to outline them at this time. The first is in relation to best available science for the objectivity criterion in consideration of recreation impacts. And here we believe that the council staff erred in finding that DWR was not necessarily required to conduct in-person surveys in order to meet the objectivity criterion, which is outlined in footnote 19 on page 57. We disagree with the council staff's finding in this area and believe it sets an unfortunate precedent for the future. Relying upon recreation demand models should not be a substitute for actually understanding recreation use at a location. Well-established procedures for surveying recreation use are applied by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation, and California Department of Parks and Recreation. DWR should have selected one of those procedures, one of those models, and used it to understand the recreation use at Lookout Slew. As appellant Liberty Island Access demonstrated, there are approaches to understanding recreation use at a particular site that are low cost and easy to utilize. And I referenced footnote 19 a moment ago, and here's a quote from it, in quotation marks, well-established best practices for performing site analysis of recreational usage do not exist like they do for threatened species, end of quote. And this was specifically to address the commission's comment about survey work being numerous and extensive for threatened and endangered species, but being nearly absent for recreational use at the project site. Even though that could be true, and I don't know if it is true because these procedures that are utilized by other agencies might argue otherwise, but even if there is not a process such as there is for endangered species, that's not a reason for the council to accept models that estimate regional recreation demand as a substitute for actual recreation use at a site. Thank you, Brandon. This is particularly relevant as we consider a suite of Delta unique values that might be affected by projects on the horizon. For many impacts to the unique Delta values, there are no agencies specifying what data ought to be collected. And we worry that footnote 19 suggests that in those cases, no data must be collected and project proponents can certify projects without any valid data-based understanding of how a project may be altering baseline conditions of important unique Delta values. That's one. The second point I wanted to raise in objection to the council staff's draft determination has to do with policy RRP1, which relates to levy funding. And while we appreciate the council's recognition of the commission's unique role in an appeal procedure, which is discussed on pages 14 and 15 of the draft determination, and our ability to provide testimony and comment regarding an appeal, quote, in the spirit of the Delta Reform Act. The Delta Reform Act, which of course both created the council, the Sacramento San Joaquin Delta Conservancy, and also established the co-equal goals for the Delta, was enacted in the same legislative package that amended the Delta Protection Act of 1992, which is our commission's governing statute, and includes Public Resources Code section 29773, which requires the council to adopt a recommendation if, in its discretion, a recommendation by the commission, if in its discretion, the council determines it to be feasible. And it's in the spirit of the Delta Reform Act that the commission objects to the exclusion of information we provided that demonstrates, we believe, that DWR did not comply with Delta Plan Policy RRP1, again, the policy requiring balancing investment to achieve goals for levee improvements in the Delta. Specifically, DWR's certification lacks any evidence of how its allocation of levy funds to this project contributes to a long-term balance of levy investments across the 9 goals of RRP1. The commission submitted information was from DWR's own submittals to the California Natural Resources Agency, Bond Accountability website, and the council's own certifications of consistency on levee improvement projects. And we believe it demonstrates that it is possible to provide evidence of consistency with RRP1, but that DWR just neglected to do so. So we ask that the council consider recognizing both this lack of evidence by DWR and the clear message conveyed by the information we provided in our attachment A to our May 11th, 2021 letter, and find that DWR is not consistent with RRP1. Let me just conclude by saying the Delta region relies upon the Stewardship Council to ensure that the Delta is protected and enhanced, even as we go about accomplishing the co-equal goals for the Delta. It is simply false to suggest that this cannot be accomplished in the case of the Lookout Slough project. And while we appreciate these late moves and the comment that DWR made about their efforts to quickly convene this group has not been convened to date. The MOU with Solano County is largely silent on recreation impacts. And as I stated in my May 20th comments to the council, we believe these deficiencies can be remedied. At the same time, we don't believe that is a reason for dismissing the appeals, the valid appeals, and the valid arguments that the council staff presented in the staff draft determination. We stand ready to work with DWR and recreation interests to find solutions. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. Council members, any questions for Eric Vink?
Sure.
Don?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. Not so much a question for Eric, but I would, again, referencing certainly the submittal by the commission and the comments by Eric, I would appreciate if our staff could go back, particularly to the point about commission review and comments, and then the citations that were outlined by Mr. Vink as it relates to the relationship between the commission and the council on matters, but also then the issue about submittal of information within the 30-day time frame for appeals, and obviously fairness to the certifiers and so forth. But I guess because I think this is, as I at least consider it, is an important point and relevant. So I guess I'd like to hear from our staff. Certainly it's noted in the draft staff recommendation, but it sounds to me like there's some issue of difference, or I might go as far as say as dispute as to how the commission weighs in a process such as this appeals process versus others who file appeals within a certain time frame. So I guess I'd like to get some clarification around that from our staff, if I could, Madam Chair. Thanks. And if, Eric, if you wanted to weigh in any further, but I just making the notes and the points you referenced, I'm seeking some clarification. Thanks.
Councilmember Natoli, I'm happy to provide that background.
Okay.
And this is in large part in response to how staff addressed the comments from the Delta Protection Commission that were received with regard to the role of the commission in appeals. And maybe put more simply, the question, why is it that we interpret that the commission can only address issues on appeal and not bring up new issues? And we've added a new section to the determination, again, in section D, that describes the role of the commission that's defined in the Reform Act and the appeals procedures, which Mr. Vink summarized for your benefit in his presentation. We've also added an explanation in footnote 8 on page 14 of the determination, explaining why the commission cannot identify new appeal issues at this point in the process. And this is, as you mentioned, largely out of fairness to the certifying party, but also it's a requirement that the commission focus its arguments and evidence on issues that are already raised by appellants. And in this manner, with regard, I think, the issue that we're trending toward is the balance of levy funding over time. And as we note in our analysis of DPP1 in the determination, no appellant identified that specifically as an issue as part of its appeals of DPP1. And so mainly the Reform Act provides a 30-day deadline for appeals and allows any person to appeal. And the appeal procedures provide that the DPC may testify before or provide input to the council regarding an appeal. And the fairness then to the certifying party would be challenging if those issues were able to be identified after the appeal window. And that's largely why the council does not consider the question of whether or how the department balanced its investments, which are actually also different than achievement, which is the requirement of RRP1. We did not consider the balance of investments over time as part of our analysis of RRP1 because that specific issue was not raised by any appellant. And the appeals that we did receive on RRP1 were on matters other than that distributed funding or achievement of the goals over time. Does that help clarify your question, Supervisor?
Yes, it does, Jeff. I guess maybe just to follow on then, if I take from the explanation, certainly the written footnotes and what you've just offered, then in the event of again, this is hypothetical, but it's certainly, I think it's relevant, of a future certification, then do I take it that if the information is to be entered into the record, whether it's regarding, in this case, obviously the levy, investment, balancing and so forth, but for the commission's part in that, they're under the same constraints, at least as we interpret it, as it relates to a 30-day period in which to actually file an appeal or get the matter on the record in order to actually have it properly considered by staff going through a process of consistency. Is that accurate? Or maybe I'm not portraying it exactly right, but that the commission is under the same constraints in its review and submittals on appeals as would be any other appellant.
Go ahead, Sarah.
Jump in a little bit. What Jeff said was accurate. I just wanted to clarify. Again, I think the differences between new issues for which, the certifying party would have to prepare their response versus issues that or comments that address issues that had been raised by appellants. So if there are new issues raised by the Delta Protection Commission that are not related to or don't concern an issue already in appeal, those would be considered as separate. But if the commission comments on issues that had been raised on an appeal, then those would be considered within the process and evidence looked at as well. However, it's a little bit, I don't want to say, it's uncertain for the commission if it chooses not to file an appeal, so to speak, early in the process within the 30-day window, whether or not the issues they're particularly concerned about would be raised by an appellant. But that is the distinction once we're in the appeal process.
Okay. Again, I think it's noteworthy, and certainly we're focused on this particular appeal, but for the future, obviously there's currency to it, but for the future, I think it's important. And obviously, being two, state agencies with distinct responsibilities that obviously have particular roles designated under the law. And I know the Attorney General provides counsel to both bodies. I just wanted to be clear about this because I think certainly as Mr. Vink has pointed out, and maybe others will as well, that there there was some interruption there. At any rate, I think that answers it now. And I don't know, I guess I would just say to Mr. Bank, if there's anything else you wanted to add, Eric, as it relates to the question, I'm interested in hearing, but otherwise, that's all the questions I have for right now. Thanks.
Okay.
Yeah. Eric?
Thank you, Don.
Yeah, thank you, council members. If I could just chime in here, and I won't read from the statute, but Public Resources Code 29773 is pretty clear and unambiguous that the commission can comment and make recommendations on any significant project or proposed project within the scope of the Delta Plan. And as I stated earlier, if the council finds in its determination that those comments are, excuse me, I just want to find the particular wording so I'm not speaking off topic. If they find that any recommendation in its discretion is, if the council determines a recommendation to be feasible from the commission, then it requires the council, Public Resources Code 29773 requires the council to adopt the recommendation. So we don't see anything that excludes that code section from appeal procedures before the council, and really are not aware of any anything in the council's regulation that would prohibit consideration of those particular comments. I appreciate the comment about it not being part of the appeal, but we're also talking about Delta Plan policies that are extremely, that are perfectly relevant in this case.
Okay, thank you, Eric. I think I saw Maria earlier with a hand raise. No, not at this time. Okay. Well, then before we move on to Appellant A1 Liberty Island Access, I'd like to take a very short 5-minute break. So council members, let's return at 11:23. See you in just a few minutes.
Hello, can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Super. First, I'd like to start off by thanking the council staff for all their hard work with drafting and creating this proposed determination. As I stated last time, I'm not a lawyer. I don't do anything of this for a living. I'm a software engineer, taking time away from work, but I've come to appreciate how much paperwork, how much reading and writing has to go into this, and so I very much appreciate the work that they've done over the last 60 days and more with regards to creating this proposed determination. I'd like to start off by speaking to some of the points that were made by DWR staff in their presentation. I'd like to begin by addressing kind of a theme that I've seen pop up. It's roughly saying that, DSC staff, like this proposed determination is letting perfect be the enemy of the good. We're creating green tape that's scaring off new projects. There's a lot of urgency behind this. I'd like to counter that by saying that this project is far from perfect. I think right now there are three other lawsuits related to this project that DWR is involved in that have nothing to do with recreation, have nothing to do with the issue that LIA is appealing. And the Department of Water Resources, I would say, have done themselves no favors in order to increase the urgency and the timeliness of this project. They've been working on this for the better part of a decade. Frankly, they seem to be experimenting with how little they can get away with. The impetus for this project comes from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, shut down their pumps, and demanded that they make these that they compensate and they mitigate for harm to aquatic life, which is a main precept of this project to begin with. Solano County, for example, when they came in with their draft environmental impact report, made their comments. They weren't taken seriously until they filed a lawsuit. At which, at that point, memorandums of understanding, dollar amounts start coming out. It seems that DWR, they knew they were cutting off access with this proposed design to public lands. The taxpayers spent somewhere around $9 million to acquire. They knew about the Delta Plan, its policies around best available science and recreational protection. I think that this back and forth that they claim is slowing them down is frankly self-inflicted. The second point I'd like to talk about is that I think any reasonable person would agree that best available science was not adhered to or followed with this project. I think that frankly, kind of the opposite is true in terms of how the council may decide on this determination. I think if they approve this project, they let it proceed. I think that frankly, there's a danger of eroding the legitimacy and the reputation of this body in the eyes of the public. I think that it's not the council's job to rubber stamp projects from the same agencies who are frankly responsible for creating some of the issues in the Delta that we're trying to address. So I wanted to address those points of urgency that have come up. The second point would be on inclusiveness. The section on recreational impact in the environmental impact report was one of the shortest. It was the shortest in terms of page length discussions in the EIR of any of the impact areas. Frankly, kind of following a theme of lack of inclusiveness. I've heard some other comments that were made by David Roloff, talking about some of the different methods they used, speaking to the fact that sometimes statistics don't include all the people that they're meant to capture. Another comment that, hey, recreational use is light, some claim there. It's hard to study and get a grasp on. To me, that these statements seem to point to the fact that if that's true, then I would have expected DWR to have included more studies. They would have created a larger catalog of scientific literature supporting their claims. They have effectively this one paragraph where they do this extrapolation based on a percentage of a census tract population from one study. If these claims are true, I would have expected more. I would have expected more inclusiveness, not less. I think that the points that were made were frankly speaking to the fact that more inclusiveness of other scientific work, frankly, should have been part of this process for analyzing recreation impacts. Let me see. In terms of, could we go to the next slide, please? I wanted to bring up some other visuals here that I've already showed in the past. DWR, in terms of inclusiveness, they didn't include both of the census tracts that the project covers. The project sits right on the boundary of two different census tracts. I show here in light blue only one of them. DWR did not include the second census tract. So another point where they're frankly, I believe, lacking in inclusivity. Could you go to the next slide, please? Instead of the population of approximately 10,000 in that one census tract, if we look at 1 hour driving distance from the Slew Bridge, we have an isochrone map here, a map showing all the areas you can drive to within 1 hour that covers almost 2 million people. So it's a factor of 200. That's more than 2 orders of magnitude of population that DWR did not include in their study. They did not include the data they needed to make the conclusions that they did on the significance of recreation. They didn't include the logic that they used to determine how people would disperse for the purposes of determining how many people are actually visiting the site. Could you go to the next slide, please? In our own surveying that we did directly with our own members, we found that the data frankly matched up with these 1 hour estimates. And if anything, they were understated. We had one individual who came all the way from Porterville, California, 3.5 hour drive during duck season to hunt up there. Most people are matching up with this 1 hour driving distance radius. And according to our own studies, which, take it as what it's worth, but what I'm showing here is that there is an order of magnitude difference in the significance of recreation that happens if you include the logic in the record that they used for dispersion, include the data that they cite, include both census tracts, and frankly more, in order to get to those responses, those answers. Next slide, please. So yeah, recreational use is significant. I'll leave on this slide for one moment. I wanted to state a few points just regarding what frankly were just some promises that many of them knew coming from the DWR presentation. One of the things I think it was Cindy Messer stated that, hey, we need a broad set of stakeholders. It was interesting to me that they didn't mention LIA at all. They didn't mention the Trust for Public Land, which was the previous property owner for Liberty Island Ecological Reserve before it was sold to the state. They didn't mention Ducks Unlimited, California Waterfowl Association. They didn't mention anybody but Solano County and CDFW. The broad set of stakeholders they're promising, frankly, that's under-promised. They showed new figures of these boat ramps. They're not in the record. Their claim of public access, pedestrian access, that's also not in the record. The record states that the gates that they indicate they want to put up will close off public access. So these are new promises showing up in this hearing, new figures, et cetera, which frankly are not on the record. I want to echo Medueno's comments, Council Member Medueno's comments that the council is not here to decide the fate of this, this project based on promises of consistency, but based on what is on the record instead. And frankly, some of the promises they made they're not sufficient. They didn't talk about any parking at the boat ramp. Right now, we have dozens and dozens of people coming with boats on weekends sometimes for duck hunting. Where are they supposed to park? These are just ideas that are kind of, sort of tossed in here in this last little 40-minute presentation that they're giving to the council. I don't think that's robust enough. I think that remanding this project, allowing them time to work through these issues, I think that is the path that needs to be taken so that some of these issues can be sorted out. Some of the nuances of this can be discussed with the broad stakeholder group that they claim they want to work with. LIA would be honored to work with them in refining this project and creating an outcome that I think all Californians can be proud of. So I guess I have about 1 minute left here. Could we go to the next few slides? Sorry, I'm losing the screen. Yeah. Recreational use here is significant. People care about this place. That's why I'm here, because enough members of the public were interested in trying to save a place that they've been frankly visiting for decades. Some of these folks, they care about it. They want to see this place thrive, both from an ecological standpoint and from a recreational standpoint. Next slide, please. So in summary, I want to just state that we agree with the council's staff's determination of inconsistency for this project and the proposed determination for remanding the project on the issue stated. We believe there are several feasible options. We've already discussed those previously. This isn't the venue for discussing those now, as the council have stated, but we do look forward to any opportunity to work with DWR, to work with a broader set of stakeholders to help refine this project and end up with a result that I think everyone in California can be proud of, and that the council can be proud of, finally approving for consistency when it gets to that point. That concludes my presentation. I will be happy to take any questions at this time.
Great, thank you. Council members, any questions for Mr. Dalkey? Well, I see no hands raised. Thank you for taking the time to present again to us today.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Let's move on to Appellant A2, Solano County Water Agency.
Hi, is everyone able to hear me okay?
Yes.
Good afternoon. My name is Lily Freeman, and I will be presenting on behalf of Solano County Water Agency. Thank you for giving me this opportunity, and thank you, board, for hearing our comments. To begin, we agree with the inconsistencies identified by Delta Stewardship Council staff with regard to recreation and access, and further request that the council reconsider other inconsistencies identified in our appeal, particularly with regard to water quality and invasive fish species. Next slide, please. I think one more, actually. First, we would like to state that DWR has not presented substantial evidence that the project is consistent with the Delta Plan and has instead chosen to rely on flawed environmental analysis conducted pursuant to CEQA. Forging ahead with this project without substantial evidence of its consistency with the Delta Plan's co-equal goals threatens an essential water supply for over 500,000 Californians and the state as a whole if agricultural operations are impaired. Next slide, please. On the issue of water quality, the evidence in the record is very clear. DWR admits that it cannot make accurate predictions to determine the significance of direct, indirect, and cumulative impacts of the project on dissolved organic carbon. Next slide, please. This acknowledgement that DWR cannot make a consistency determination requires a finding of inconsistency until DWR is able to provide feasible and effective mitigation for these potential adverse impacts. Next slide, please. With regard to invasive fish species, if the project meets its stated goals, Delta smelt will be more abundant in the project area, directly decreasing the amount of water that can be pumped from the NBA under its incidental take permit, making less water available to municipal water users throughout the NBA intake each and every year as a result of this project. Next slide, please. We would like to highlight that Solano County Water Agency has already experienced 2 pumping curtailments in 2021 as a result of the prevalence of fish species in the area. The issue of the project's impact on NBA municipal pumping restrictions from special status species was not even addressed by DWR, nor did DWR provide any potential mitigation measures should these anticipated adverse impacts occur. Next slide, please. DWR made its consistency determination based on a record of its own compilation, and the DSC has made it all but impossible to introduce new evidence challenging, or in some cases directly refuting, DWR's handpicked substantial evidence. Appealing a consistency determination based on an absence of analysis by DWR is an impossible standard that appellants have repeatedly attempted to overcome by highlighting DWR's flawed modeling and analysis, which fails to even identify potential adverse impacts to over 500,000 municipal water users in the project area. This project poses a clear threat to continued agricultural and municipal diversions in the surrounding project area and is therefore fundamentally inconsistent with the co-equal goals of the Delta Plan. Thank you for your time. I can accept any questions.
Thank you. Council members, any questions? Well, seeing no hands raised, thank you very much, Ms. Freeman.
Thank you.
We'll move on to Appellant A3, Reclamation District 2060 and Reclamation District 2068.
Good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Thank you very much. My name is Catherine Olschlager. I'm here on behalf of Reclamation Districts 2060 and 2068 appellants in this action. I'd like to first start by thanking staff and the council for what has obviously been a great deal of work to analyze this complex project and put together a detailed staff determination. Next slide, please. I'd also like to say that, make it very clear that my clients do not oppose this project. Fundamentally, they also are not opposed to restoration efforts in the Delta region. However, this project as currently conceived is fundamentally inconsistent with the Delta plan. My clients agree with the inconsistencies identified in the proposed staff determination, but we also ask that the council reconsider the other inconsistencies identified in our written submittals, particularly as to the impacts of the project with regard to protected species, water quality, flood control, and impacts to agricultural operations generally. My clients, again, represent flood control agencies, our flood control agencies in the region, but also speak on behalf of some landowners and agricultural interests, agricultural water diverters immediately adjacent to the project. Next slide, please. We believe that the project is fundamentally inconsistent with the co-equal goals of the Delta Plan. And before getting into the details of the species issues, I'd like to address how the staff determination addresses the question of consistency with the co-equal goals, because it's a bit nuanced. DWR takes the position, and staff ultimately found that policy GP1B1 does not apply, and that's the policy that deals directly with consistency with the co-equal goals of the Delta Plan. And the reason that the determination says that that is not an issue is because there is essentially a catch-all. If there are policies that an agency finds a project is not consistent with, that agency can then analyze general consistency with the co-equal goals of the Delta Plan as a way to overcome inconsistency with specific policies. The staff's draft determination finds that that's not an issue here because DWR did not avail itself of that exception. DWR took the position that this project is in fact consistent with all policies. And the draft determination says that because DWR took that position, policy GP1B1, consistency with the co-equal goals, is not at issue. It was a little circular when I first saw this because staff then went on to find in the draft determination that the project is not in fact consistent with all policies. But nonetheless, we view the co-equal goals as fundamental to the Delta Plan, and whether the project essentially takes that policy up directly, we believe that it is the council's, part of the council's role to directly address whether a project does in fact comply with the co-equal goals, and that that is critical to the analysis of consistency. This project pursues ecosystem restoration at the expense of reliable water supply. And this is directly counter to both the letter and the spirit of the Delta Plan. With that, I will address the specific issues that we feel are of particular concern with regard to our clients' ability to conduct agricultural operations and divert water for agricultural and also municipal uses in the Delta. The first issue, which was addressed by the Solano County Water Agency, is that the project does aim to increase populations of threatened species in the Delta region. That increase of species populations will ultimately require my clients and other diverters in the region to either move intakes, shut down intakes, or engage in costly upgrades to infrastructure. There is no plan in place for how that infrastructure will be constructed or funded, and the physical impacts of that infrastructure improvement have not been addressed by DWR. Because those infrastructure improvements have not been addressed, this project and the foreseeable results of the project are an existential threat to the ability for regional water diverters to continue diverting water for agricultural uses. Next slide, please. The same is true with regard to the department's analysis of water quality. And you've seen some of this language before in our initial presentation, so I won't revisit it, but the nutshell summary is that ultimately the department admits that there is no way to reasonably predict water quality impacts of this project. There's a lot of uncertainty in the models that they have used, and that uncertainty ultimately will affect my clients and their ability to divert water. And the department doesn't include mitigation for water quality impacts if they occur. So ultimately, if the predictions in the water quality modeling, which they confess are not necessarily reliable, if those predictions do not come true, there is no protection for my clients and their ability to divert water if it's not of a quality that they can continue to use that water. So the water quality impacts of this project are to some extent unknown and pose a direct threat to the ability of water users in the region to continue diverting and using water for agricultural purposes. Next slide, please. This is a specific slide addressing salinity and bromide and some of the statements in the department's own certification about the fact that this project will ultimately increase salinity and bromide. The council is likely well aware of the major issues that salinity has created with regard to surface water and groundwater in the Delta. There's no mitigation to protect against potentially catastrophic increases in salinity and bromide in the region. Next slide, please. The same is true with regard to methyl mercury. There is some question as to what the methyl mercury and mercury impacts will ultimately be in the region, because that is, as the EIR for the project says, an issue that's not well understood. Mercury and methyl mercury increases could, again, be catastrophic to my client's ability to divert water. There is no protection, no mitigation built into this project to protect against those threats. Next slide, please. Invasive aquatic weeds are obviously not just a water quality issue. They create biological issues and other ecosystem concerns. As stated in our written submittal, we have significant concerns about whether or not mitigation for the potential propagation of invasive aquatic weeds is adequate, but specifically with regard to water quality. The presence of aquatic invasive weeds like water hyacinth can have significant impacts with regard to the quality of the water, which again could ultimately mean that my clients are unable to divert it, unable to use it, or would ultimately have to engage in expensive treatment in order to do so. Next slide, please. And again, what happens if the models that the department is relying on, which they confess are not necessarily predictive, what happens if they prove incorrect? Again, my clients could be in a position of not being able to divert water. A significant number of diverters would be in a position of having to find other sources. This is expressly inconsistent with the co-equal goal of the Delta Plan of providing a reliable regional water supply. Next slide, please. We also touched during our last presentation on impacts related to flooding. My clients will ultimately experience a significant change in 40,000 acre feet of flood storage that ultimately allowed my clients the ability to essentially deal with a flooding disaster and have time to deal with a flooding disaster. The movement of that 40,000 acre feet from one side of the levee to the other will have disastrous consequences, or could have significant consequences to my clients that have not been addressed in the department's plans. Next slide, please. And finally, impacts related to agriculture, which is really at the heart of this presentation. Agricultural uses are a distinct value of the Delta and a priority expressly within and throughout the Delta Plan. Impacts to water quality and increased populations of protected fish threaten the ability of agricultural operations to divert water critical to their continued existence. Ultimately, the department is prioritizing restoration projects that ultimately are for the purpose of fulfilling mitigation obligations, where there are millions of dollars in outstanding repairs to area levees, which would be a more appropriate use of funding available to the department. Ultimately, we feel that these issues and problems with the certification do render the project inconsistent with a number of Delta Plan policies. And we provide more detail in our written submittals on that issue. But ultimately, I think on a bigger picture level, they render the project fundamentally inconsistent with the Delta Plan and its ultimate purpose, the co-equal goals, which are really at the heart of the Delta Plan. We hope that the department can make revisions to the project that will ultimately allow the project to go forward and coexist in harmony with all of these surrounding uses, including not just recreational, but agricultural. And we hope that the council will reconsider the staff's determination of denial on the issues raised in the Reclamation District's appeals. Thank you very much for the opportunity to present.
Council members, are there any questions for Ms. Olschlager? I hope I'm saying your name correctly.
You did very well. Thank you.
Well, I do not see any hands raised, so thank you again.
Very much.
On to Appellant A4, Central Delta Water Agency.
So I've moved Dante over. Can you hear us, Dante?
Yeah, I'm on. Am I next?
Yes.
You are.
Thanks.
You are.
Good. Hi, Dante.
Thank you very much. First, I'd like to recognize the compliments to your staff for their courteous and patient dealing with all the participants in this case. Although I don't agree with their conclusions, I certainly appreciate their courtesies. First of all, our objection to the consistency determination relating to RRP1, which is prioritization of state investments in delta levees and flood risk, was dismissed by the staff recommendation because it did not raise appealable issues and it was outside the council's jurisdiction. Both we think are incorrect. As to council's jurisdiction to deal with the issue of priorities for levies and recommendations with regard to that and flood risk is supported in statute by section 85-306, which requires that the council, in conjunction with the Central Valley Flood Protection Board, shall recommend in the Delta Plan priorities for state investments in levee operation, maintenance, and improvements in the Delta. So I don't understand how it could be outside the jurisdiction. As to whether or not our appeal is non-appealable, we raised the issue that the funding for the Lookout Slew improperly took funds away from Proposition 1, $295 million that was appropriated, not appropriated, but allocated directly to the improvement of Delta levees through the Delta levee programs and through emergencies. Now, we raised a number of issues with regard to this, and what you have before you on the slide is the flood hazard mitigation plan for the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta, dated September 15th, 1983. This flood hazard mitigation plan was put together during the 1980s when we had a series of levee breaks in the Delta, and FEMA assistance was a major part of the recovery effort at that time. Now, recovery is a part of your RRP1 and a very important part, as is emergency preparedness and emergency response. Now, in the future, if we have a disaster in the Delta, we're going to need the 75% that the federal government usually brings to the state to help in this assistance. Now let's go to the next page of this visual. These are the islands designated in the flood hazard mitigation plan that need levee rehabilitation. The state commitment at the time was to proceed with levee programs that would eventually get these levee systems to an engineering standard equivalent to Bulletin 192-82 of the Department of Water Resources, which is close to the engineering standard in PL 84-99 of the Corps of Engineers. So it's absolutely essential that you understand that the Lookout Slew project is not in this area. It's up in the northwesterly corner of this picture. It's not one of the levee systems that was required to be addressed by the flood hazard mitigation plan. And when we ignore this fact, FEMA could very well use this as a basis for rejection of assistance to the state of California in the future when we need them the most. Let's go to the next slide. Now, those of us that are familiar with levees, and I think the Department of Water Resources is and should be, and you should be as well. The risk to the delta and preserving the delta in the future is not related to the YOLO bypass levee and the construction of a new setback in connection with Lookout Slew. That has a very minimal beneficial impact even to the areas protected by the bypass. And that area is primarily the Sacramento area and our capital, which should be protected. But it should not be protected in this manner at the expense of keeping resources committed to bringing the levees that are most vulnerable to the preservation of the delta up to an adequate standard. Now, these islands identified here are identified for the purpose of displaying what an earthquake risk would do to the delta. And this is DWR production. This isn't anything our people have done. And you can see that the YOLO bypass is not in this particular area. It's not in the red area. These are levees that need to be protected from an earthquake risk standpoint. Let's go to the next slide. Now, there is a flood emergency plan by DWR that does not get a great deal of attention. But this flood emergency plan is going to guide in a great, to a great extent, what DWR is going to react to. Let's go to the next page of this. These red dots are the red dots displaying the 20 potential simultaneous levee breaks in the delta that could occur from an earthquake, which I don't know if it's credible or not. DWR presented it as such, and in the engineering circles of the DWR and the Corps of Engineers, there's some credence to this. But again, the YOLO bypass levee that's involving the Lookout Slew project is not in this area. And it is not one of the critical levees. Let's go to the next slide. Now, with regard to water delivery to the export pumps that supply the metropolitan areas throughout the state, we all know the publicity is that 24 million people or thereabouts get some portion of their water supply from the Delta. Well, the Metropolitan Water District is very interested in this subject, and they should be, because they supply water that goes to the suppliers of the urban areas. And they are very interested, as we are in the Central Delta Water Agency, with the freshwater pathway. Now let's go to the next slide. The freshwater pathway involves old and middle rivers. And you can see they're depicted on this slide on the right-hand side. And that's the two routes that go all the way from Clifton Court, Forebay, and the Tracy Pumping Plant of the federal government over to the Sacramento River. Those levee systems along that path are critical to the sustainability of water delivery through the State Water Project and the Central Valley Project. And it's the interruption of such delivery that's important to all these agencies that supply urban areas. Let's go to the next slide. And you can see the red area is the salinity that would come in if we lost these various levee systems in the delta. And I know my time is limited and probably gone, but it's critical that we not allow the recommendation of the staff to preclude the board from remanding to the Department of Water Resources this issue with regard to prioritization of funding of delta levees. There's other money that can fund this work at Lookout Slew. In fact, the water contractor should pay the cost of that project. It shouldn't even come from public funds, but certainly should not be taken away. The funds should not be taken away from the critical needs in delta levee protection. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Nomalini. Council members, any questions? Okay. Seeing no hands raised, then we'll proceed to conclude today's portion of the hearing. This concludes the oral presentations. Thank you all to all participants and attendees. This hearing is in recess for the rest of today. The council meeting and this hearing will reconvene tomorrow, Friday, July 16, 2021 at 9 a.m. The first item on the agenda for tomorrow in this hearing is this hearing. The hearing will start with public comment, followed by council consideration of the proposed determination and adoption of findings that dismiss, deny, and or remand the issues on appeal. So we'll see you all tomorrow.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.